What if I told you? Once upon this land, not in legend, but in living memory, there was a war so vast it split a nation in two. Not in borders, but in hearts. Not in maps, but in souls. It wasn't fought in distant deserts or foreign kingdoms. It was brother against brother, father against son, neighbour against neighbour. And beneath every battlefield was a silent prayer, buried in the mud. Cannons roared like thunder over wheat fields. Letters written by candlelight trembled in trembling hands. And freedom, that sacred word, was debated, defended, betrayed, and finally reborn. But the story they told you in school was only the shell. Tonight, we peel back the silence. We listen not to generals, but to the forgotten. The cooks, the nurses, the barefoot soldiers, the ones who sang into the smoke and never came home. This is the story of how a young country nearly tore itself apart, and how, through grief, it found something unbreakable. So settle in, dim the lights, and close your eyes. Because once you see what the United States looked like during its darkest hour, you'll understand why it was never the same again. And if you're new here, subscribe to Sleepless Dude, tap like if this helped you wind down, and in the comments tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now breathe in and return with me to the camps, the fields, the hymns, the burning letters, and the cracked Liberty Bell, to the American Civil War before the dust had time to settle. In the decades before the American Civil War, the United States existed in a state of uneasy compromise. It was a young republic, less than a century old, but already carrying contradictions so deep they threatened to tear the entire nation apart. At the core of those contradictions was slavery, an institution older than the republic itself, woven into its economy, its politics, and its very identity. For some, slavery was a necessary evil reluctantly defended. For others, it was a positive good, justified by arguments of race and biblical destiny. And for still others, particularly in the industrializing North, it was an abomination, a stain on the nation's democratic ideals. This clash of perspectives was not abstract. It shaped daily lives, state economies, and political choices, each pushing the Union closer to fracture. In the years following the American Revolution, the founders had struggled to reconcile liberty with slavery. The Constitution itself bore the scars of compromise. The 3/5 clause that counted enslaved people as partial persons for representation. The fugitive slave clause requiring their return if they escaped to free states, and the absence of any language condemning the practice outright. These half measures were intended to hold the fragile new Union together, but they left the problem unresolved. As the United States expanded westward, each new territory reopened the question, would it be slave or free? Every new state became a battlefield in miniature, its status threatening to tilt the delicate balance in Congress. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Missouri Compromise and later the Compromise of 1850 attempted to draw lines across maps that would settle the issue. Missouri was admitted as a slave state while Maine entered as free, preserving balance for the moment. Later, the admission of California as free was paired with a harsher fugitive slave law meant to appease the South. These deals postponed conflict, but never resolved it. Each compromise functioned like a bandage placed over a wound that only deepened. Northerners resented being compelled to enforce slavery in their own communities, while Southerners feared the steady encirclement of their way of life. The Union was a house with its foundation cracked, each year's legislation another patch on the walls, even as the ground beneath shifted. The economy too widened the divide. The North surged into the industrial age, factories, railroads, and growing immigrant labour transforming cities into hubs of manufacturing. The South, by contrast, doubled down on its agrarian model, driven by cotton, tobacco, and enslaved labour. These were not merely regional preferences, but competing systems of survival. A northern farmer might see profit in wheat, canals, and rail lines to Chicago. A southern planter depended on enslaved workers to plant, pick, and process cotton for distant markets like Liverpool. In Congress, these differences turned into battle lines over tariffs, banking, and land policy. In daily life, they created cultural stereotypes, the greedy Yankee or the lazy Southerner, that hardened suspicion. Religion, too, played its role. The Second Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical revivalism that swept the country in the early 19th century, inspired abolitionist fervour in the North. Ministers thundered from pulpits about the sin of slavery, while pamphlets and tracts spread calls for immediate emancipation. In response, Southern churches split from their Northern counterparts, declaring slavery divinely ordained. Denominations fractured, Methodists, Baptists and Presbyterians all divided along sectional lines, mirroring the division of the country itself. Faith, once a unifying force in American life, now reinforced the split. The political landscape became even more volatile with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law, championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, repealed the Missouri Compromise line and allowed settlers to decide for themselves whether a territory would permit slavery. The result was Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory, clashing in violence that previewed the war to come. Towns were burned, families terrorized, and at least 55 people killed. Here was a grim foreshadowing. When left to popular sovereignty, Americans did not debate slavery peacefully. They fought with guns and fire. The violence in Kansas shocked the nation, but it did not stop there. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech in Congress denouncing slavery and insulting Southern leaders. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner nearly to death with a cane. The image of blood on the Senate floor became a metaphor for the state of the Union itself, where reasoned debate had given way to violence. Southerners sent Brooks new canes engraved with the words "Hit him again." Northerners raised money to replace Sumner's broken chair. The divisions were no longer political alone, they were cultural, personal, and visceral. Meanwhile, enslaved people themselves resisted in ways that shaped the national conversation. The Underground Railroad funneled fugitives northward, aided by networks of abolitionists and free black communities. Each successful escape infuriated Southern slaveholders, who saw their property disappearing and their security threatened. The publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 further inflamed passions. Northerners devoured the novel. Many moved to abolitionist conviction by its portrayal of slavery's cruelty. Southerners condemned it as slander and propaganda. When Abraham Lincoln reportedly met Stowe during the war and called her the little lady who started this great war, it was more than a joke. It was an acknowledgement of the power of stories to move nations. By the late 1850s, the country had reached a fever pitch. The Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that African Americans, free or enslaved, could not be citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. To Northerners, this was evidence that the slave power conspiracy had infiltrated every branch of government. To Southerners, it was validation of their constitutional rights. Violence flared again with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an attempt to spark a massive slave uprising. Though Brown was captured and executed, he became a martyr to Northern abolitionists and terrorist to Southern planters. The nation watched his hanging with a mixture of fear and fascination, wondering whether his attempt at insurrection was a glimpse of what lay ahead. As the election of 1860 approached, the Union teetered on the edge. The newly formed Republican Party, founded on opposition to the spread of slavery, nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist. He spoke of restricting slavery's expansion, not immediate emancipation, but to the South, his victory represented a mortal threat. When he won, with no electoral votes from the southern states, secession followed. South Carolina led the way in December 1860, declaring its departure from the Union. Other states soon followed, forming the Confederate States of America. The center had not held. The compromises of decades had finally collapsed under the weight of irreconcilable differences. The United States had entered a moment it could not turn back from. The debates were over, the ballots cast, the compromises exhausted. The nation had chosen division over unity, and the consequence was war. But how exactly did the step from secession declarations to open battle occur? What was it like in those final, anxious months when the country shifted from political rupture to military confrontation? When South Carolina declared its secession in December 1860, the act was more than symbolic. It was the opening rupture in a structure already cracked by years of strain. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. their legislatures drafting ordinances of secession that cited the defense of slavery as their reason for departure. The words were often couched in constitutional arguments, states' rights, sovereignty, freedom of self-determination, but the central thread remained unbroken. Slavery was the foundation each declaration defended. To many Southerners, Lincoln's election signaled not just political defeat, but the coming end of the society they had built on enslaved labour. To leave the Union was, in their view, to preserve what they called their way of life. In Washington, the mood was tense, uncertain, and at times surreal. James Buchanan still held the presidency, a man whose indecision in those crucial months became infamous. Buchanan argued that while secession was illegal, he also believed the federal government lacked the power to stop it. This paradox meant that while states were leaving one by one, the administration did almost nothing to halt the tide. Cabinet members resigned, the Treasury grew unstable, and Southern congressmen packed their belongings, their seats in the chamber falling empty as if the government itself were dissolving in real time. For those who remained loyal to the Union, it was like watching a house burn from within, while its caretaker insisted that no water could be fetched. Lincoln, still in Springfield awaiting his inauguration, could do little but prepare his words. He received letters daily, some urging compromise, others calling for firmness. Friends warned him of assassination plots should he travel openly to Washington. His measured silence in those months gave him an aura of mystery. Supporters trusted that he would stand firm against disunion, while opponents feared the worst. When he finally departed for the capital in February 1861, his train passed through towns where crowds gathered in equal measure to cheer and to threaten. In Baltimore, he was smuggled through under disguise to avoid a rumoured assassination attempt. By the time he arrived in Washington, the city itself was a fortress in waiting, nervous of its Southern sympathisers and vulnerable borders. Meanwhile, in the seceding states, leaders moved quickly to form a new government. Delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, in February 1861, and within days established the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution modelled closely on that of the United States, but with explicit protections for slavery and greater emphasis on states' rights. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was elected president, a choice intended to balance military experience, political stature, and regional loyalty. In ceremonies attended by cheering crowds, the Confederate experiment was launched with a sense of destiny, as though history had ordained a separate nation carved from the Union's soil. Newspapers in the South spoke with confidence, predicting that Northern industry would never sustain a war effort, that European powers dependent on cotton would guarantee recognition and support. Few believed the separation would lead to years of devastating bloodshed. Yet despite the confident tone, uncertainty lingered even in the South. Not every slaveholding state joined immediately. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas hesitated, their populations divided between loyalty to the Union and solidarity with the seceded states. Border states like Kentucky and Missouri teetered on the edge, their loyalties fractured down to towns, neighborhoods, and families. Maryland, too, posed a unique challenge, for its proximity to Washington meant that if it left, the nation's capital would be surrounded. These hesitant states became crucial prizes, their decisions capable of altering the balance of power. In them, debates raged not only in legislatures, but at kitchen tables, in town squares, and on the floors of state conventions, as ordinary people weighed the risks of war against the pull of shared Southern identity. Military tensions simmered quietly but unmistakably. Federal property, forts, arsenals, and customs houses lay scattered across the South, symbols of authority that seceding states sought to seize. In many places, local militias marched in and claimed them with little resistance. But in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, one federal stronghold remained, Fort Sumter. Commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born Union officer, the fort became a symbol of the standoff. Anderson, short of supplies and men, held out while Confederate officials demanded surrender. In the starlit nights of early 1861, Charleston citizens could look out over the harbour and see the flag of the United States still flying defiantly above the stone walls, a reminder that though states had declared departure, the Union had not yet recognised their absence. In the North, the response to secession was a mix of outrage, disbelief, and resignation. Newspapers debated whether the Union should let the South go in peace or force it to return. Merchants worried about the collapse of trade, as Southern cotton sustained much of the Northern textile economy. Workers feared unemployment if mills ran dry. Farmers wondered about access to markets along the Mississippi. For many ordinary Northerners, the abstract questions of constitutional authority came down to survival and livelihood. Yet, alongside these concerns, a swelling determination grew. If secession succeeded unchallenged, what would remain of the Union? Could any state leave at will, tearing the nation apart piece by piece? These were the questions that lingered in taverns, town halls, and city streets. As March approached, Lincoln prepared for his inauguration with words carefully chosen to balance firmness and conciliation. His address on March 4, 1861, was delivered beneath the shadow of armed guards and freshly mounted cannon, the Capitol dome still unfinished above him. In it he declared that secession was void, that the Union was perpetual, and that he would enforce federal law in all states. Yet he also promised not to initiate aggression, appealing to the better angels of our nature. The speech, calm but resolute, was received with mixed ears. To the North, reassurance. To the South, confirmation that compromise was over. Still, no shots had yet been fired. For weeks after Lincoln took office, the country seemed balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the first spark. Fort Sumter remained the focal point, supplies dwindling, Confederate patience thinning. Diplomats and mediators attempted last-minute negotiations, proposing conferences, truces, and even new compromises. But trust had evaporated. The South insisted on recognition of independence, the North insisted on preservation of the Union. Both sides, in truth, awaited the inevitable break. Soldiers drilled in town greens, militias assembled, and families wrote anxious letters about the uncertain future. It was as though the entire nation was holding its breath. And so, in those early months of 1861, the United States stood suspended between peace and war, between compromise and confrontation. The structures of government strained under the weight of division. Ordinary citizens adjusted to the possibility of rupture, and the last fragile ties of unity frayed with each passing day. The final question lingered in every corner of the Republic. When the moment came, who would fire the first shot, and how would the nation respond once the silence was broken? As the spring of 1861 approached, all eyes turned to Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter, its stone walls rising from the water, stood as the last Union bastion in a city that had become the heart of secession. Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison lived under constant watch, their supplies dwindling, their position isolated. Across the harbour, Confederate batteries lined the shores, their cannons aimed squarely at the fort. For months, the two sides had stared at each other across the water, a silent confrontation awaiting the slightest movement. The symbolism was clear. If the United States flag continued to wave over Fort Sumter, secession was not complete. If the Confederacy took it by force, then the break would be undeniable. Lincoln, newly inaugurated, faced a dilemma that carried immense weight. He had pledged not to initiate hostilities, yet he could not allow federal property to be seized without response. In early April, he informed the governor of South Carolina that he intended to resupply Fort Sumter with provisions, not reinforcements. It was a careful move, an effort to sustain the fort without provoking direct aggression. But to Confederate leaders, even food and fuel represented defiance. They would not permit what they saw as a foreign garrison to remain in their harbour. Jefferson Davis, urged by his cabinet, authorised General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand surrender. Anderson refused. The standoff, quiet for so long, was about to explode. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell arced across the pre-dawn sky, bursting above Fort Sumter. It was the signal. Confederate batteries opened fire and the harbour thundered with the roar of artillery. For 34 hours, cannonballs rained upon the fort, striking its walls, igniting fires, and sending plumes of smoke drifting into the city. Charleston citizens gathered along the shoreline, watching the bombardment like spectators at a grim spectacle. Some cheered each strike, others stood in solemn silence, aware that a line had been crossed that could never be redrawn. Inside the fort, Anderson's men endured the barrage with little means of reply, their guns outnumbered, their supplies nearly gone. By April 13th, Anderson knew resistance was futile. With his walls crumbling and his men exhausted, he agreed to evacuate. Remarkably, no lives were lost in the bombardment itself, though the first deaths of the war occurred during a tragic accident when a cannon exploded during the surrender salute. Yet the absence of heavy casualties did not soften the impact. The Confederate flag now flew where the United States flag had once stood, and the sound of cannon fire had echoed across the nation. The war, long feared and long delayed, had begun. News of Sumter's fall electrified the country. In the North, shock quickly turned to fury. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, his proclamation framed not as conquest but as defense of the Union. Across northern towns and cities, men enlisted in droves, crowds filling squares to hear speeches, bands playing patriotic tunes, flags unfurled from windows. The enthusiasm carried a sense of duty, but also of disbelief. Few imagined that the conflict would last more than a few months. "On to Richmond," came the cry, as if the Confederate capital could be seized quickly and the Union restored before autumn leaves fell. In the South, the response was equally decisive. The attack on Sumter united wavering states, sweeping away hesitation. Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina seceded, bringing their resources, soldiers, and prestige to the Confederacy. Richmond replaced Montgomery as the Confederate capital, chosen both for its industry and its symbolism as the heart of Virginia. Across southern towns, celebrations followed Sumter's fall, but alongside them came a grim recognition. War meant sacrifice. Militia units drilled in dusty fields, families prepared for separation, and slaveholders worried about the loyalty of the enslaved people, who now found themselves living in the midst of war zones. The border states became the critical question. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were deeply divided, their populations pulled in both directions. Lincoln knew that if Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would be isolated. He acted swiftly, declaring martial law in key areas, arresting secessionist leaders, and keeping the state in the Union by force if necessary. In Kentucky, neutrality was declared at first, though conflict would soon tear the state apart. Missouri descended into guerrilla warfare, its countryside filled with irregular fighters who blurred the line between soldier and outlaw. These states, perched uneasily between Union and Confederacy, would become battlegrounds in their own right, their loyalty contested in every town and county. The opening of the war revealed how unprepared both sides were for what lay ahead. The Union, with its larger population and industrial base, lacked experienced military leadership and organization. The Confederacy, though blessed with skilled officers like Robert E. Lee, faced shortages of arms, supplies, and ships. Both sides expected a short conflict, a series of battles that would decide the matter swiftly. But beneath those expectations lay the deeper truth. The divisions of decades could not be resolved in months. The war would stretch across years, its battles reshaping the nation and testing the endurance of its people. Ordinary life shifted overnight. In the North, factories shifted to war production, while women took on roles in hospitals and homes stretched by the absence of fathers, brothers, and sons. In the South, families faced blockades that cut off trade, shortages that turned luxury into scarcity, and the ever-present fear of Union invasion. For the enslaved, the war carried the weight of uncertain possibility. Was this the conflict that would finally break their chains, or merely another struggle fought over their bodies without their freedom in mind? Across the Republic, whether in northern towns or southern plantations, the war became the air people breathed, its presence inescapable. The cannon fire at Fort Sumter had been only the beginning. What followed would be years of blood, fire, and endurance, as the Union and Confederacy struggled not only over territory, but over the meaning of America itself. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter, how a divided nation, having crossed the line into war, would stumble toward its first true clash of armies. But when those eager volunteers marched south in the summer of 1861, convinced the war would be brief and glorious, did they understand what awaited them on the fields of Virginia? Did they know that their first great battle would shatter illusions on both sides and prove that this war was not to be short, nor simple, nor easily won? The Civil War did not erupt out of a vacuum. Long before the cannons at Fort Sumter spoke, the ballot box had already ignited the fuse. The election of 1860 was not just another contest for the presidency. It was the breaking point in a nation that had been stitching compromise after compromise into a fabric already frayed. It brought to the surface every unresolved question of slavery, expansion, and political power, and it placed them into the hands of voters whose decisions would alter the course of the Republic. To understand why secession followed so swiftly after Lincoln's victory, one must step back into the turbulent political stage of the late 1850s, when parties collapsed, new ones emerged, and the very structure of democracy seemed on trial. By the time Abraham Lincoln's name appeared on the ballot, the political landscape had already been shattered. The once dominant Whig Party had collapsed in the early 1850s, torn apart by divisions over slavery. Out of its ruins arose the Republican Party, a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. Their platform was not outright abolition, but opposition to the expansion of slavery into Western territories. For many in the North, this position struck a balance. Slavery could be tolerated where it already existed, but it should not spread. For the South, however, even this stance seemed intolerable. Limiting expansion meant strangling slavery's future, and without new states to bolster Southern power, the institution they depended upon would, they believed, eventually collapse. The Democrats, once a national party, fractured under the weight of sectional pressure. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, clung to the doctrine of popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in each territory could vote on slavery themselves. Southern Democrats, by contrast, demanded federal protection of slavery in all territories, regardless of local sentiment. The split proved irreparable. When the Democratic Convention in Charleston collapsed without agreement, the party divided. Douglas ran as the Northern Democratic candidate, while John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky carried the Southern banner. A fourth party, the Constitutional Unionists, nominated John Bell of Tennessee, appealing vaguely to preservation of the Union without directly addressing slavery at all. The result was an election with four candidates, each representing a fractured vision of America's future. Lincoln, little known outside Illinois just a few years earlier, emerged as the Republican choice after skillfully navigating party politics at their convention in Chicago. His background appealed to many: a self-made lawyer born in a Kentucky log cabin, a man of modest beginnings, who embodied upward mobility. His debates with Douglas during their Senate race in 1858 had catapulted him to national attention, showcasing his ability to argue with clarity and moral conviction. Though he lost that Senate contest, his profile rose high enough that Republicans saw in him a candidate who could unite their diverse coalition. Unlike more radical figures, Lincoln had avoided fiery denunciations of slavery in places where they might alienate moderate voters, yet his firm stance against expansion satisfied the moral urgency of the party's base. The campaign unfolded against a backdrop of fear and uncertainty. Newspapers blared partisan headlines, painting each candidate as the saviour or destroyer of the Union. In the North, Lincoln's supporters rallied with torchlight parades, singing campaign songs that hailed him as the rail splitter, a symbol of humble virtue. In the South, rumours spread that his election would unleash chaos, slave insurrections, racial equality, and the ultimate destruction of Southern society. In some states, Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot. So deeply did local leaders reject the legitimacy of his candidacy. Voters, instead of choosing among four men, were choosing among four futures for the country, each incompatible with the others. On Election Day, November 6, 1860, the results revealed the stark sectional divide. Lincoln carried every free state except New Jersey, securing a majority in the Electoral College with no support from the South. He received about 40% of the popular vote, far from a sweeping mandate, yet the fractured opposition ensured his victory. Douglas, despite a national campaign that saw him personally stump across both North and South, won only Missouri and part of New Jersey. Breckinridge carried most of the Deep South, while Bell won in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The map told the story plainly. America had voted, but not as one nation. It had voted as two, with Lincoln elected as president of a union that half the country no longer recognized. The reaction in the South was immediate and visceral. Even before Lincoln took office, secessionists declared his election proof that the federal government was now an enemy to their way of life. They argued that with no electoral support from southern states, his administration would rule without legitimacy over them. Meetings were called in town halls and courthouses, where fiery speeches painted secession not as rebellion but as self-defense. Ordinary citizens attended rallies where flags of a new southern nation were unfurled, and printers rushed to publish pamphlets outlining the legal and moral justification for leaving the Union. It was not merely Lincoln's victory that unsettled them. It was the realization that demography and industrialization had shifted the balance of power permanently to the North. The South, once dominant in national politics, now found itself outnumbered, its future dictated by outsiders. Yet not all Southerners agreed. In states like Georgia and Virginia, Unionists argued fiercely against secession, warning that disunion would bring ruin. They pointed to the strength of the North, the uncertainty of foreign recognition, and the devastation that war would inevitably bring. In quiet conversations, merchants worried about losing northern markets. Small farmers feared destruction of their livelihoods, and enslaved people whispered of what freedom might mean should war break the bonds of slavery. The election had divided not just North and South, but Southern communities themselves. Families, congregations, and neighbourhoods split over whether to remain in the Union or cast their lot with secession. For Northerners, Lincoln's victory carried mixed feelings. Supporters celebrated, seeing in him a chance to halt the spread of slavery and defend the Republic's integrity. Others, more cautious, worried that the South would truly follow through on its threats. Businessmen fretted about markets, and ordinary workers asked whether war might mean conscription or higher prices for bread and coal. Still, many took comfort in the belief that the South's fiery talk was mere bluster, that cooler heads would prevail. Few could yet imagine the depth of the break that was coming. The election of 1860 was therefore not just about who would occupy the White House, it was about whether the American experiment itself could endure. By choosing Lincoln, the North declared its refusal to allow slavery's expansion. By rejecting him, the South declared that it no longer trusted the Union to protect its interests. The stage was set, not for compromise, but for collision. The ballots had been cast, the results declared. But what happens when half a country refuses to recognize the legitimacy of its president? What happens when the act of voting itself becomes the final push toward war? The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 was more than a change of leadership. It was a declaration that the balance of power in the United States had shifted permanently. To many in the South, the outcome confirmed their worst fears. The North had grown too large, too industrial, and too politically united. The victory of a man who had not appeared on Southern ballots symbolized the end of their influence within the Union. Within weeks, words turned into actions. On December the 20th, 1860, South Carolina passed its Ordinance of Secession, declaring that the Union was dissolved. Bells rang in Charleston, cannon salutes thundered over the harbour, and crowds gathered in celebration. To the people there, it felt like liberation, the beginning of a new destiny free from Northern interference. The declaration was not simply rhetorical. South Carolina's leaders published a declaration of the immediate causes, carefully listing their grievances. At its core, it pointed directly to slavery, Northern hostility, refusal to enforce fugitive slave, laws, and the growing power of abolitionist voices. In plain words, they argued that the Compact of Union had been broken, that the federal government was no longer willing to protect what they considered property and rights. This document, circulated widely, left little ambiguity. The reason for leaving was slavery, and the election of Lincoln was the final evidence that it could no longer be safeguarded inside the United States. The news spread quickly across the South. In Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, secession conventions convened in state capitals, their delegates weighing the risks of departure against the fear of subjugation under a Republican president. In many of these states, debates were fierce. Planters, with vast investments in human chattel, pressed urgently for leaving the Union. Merchants and small farmers often hesitated, fearing disruption to trade and livelihoods. Yet one by one, from January through early February of 1861, these states voted to secede. Each declaration echoed South Carolina's, naming Lincoln's election and Northern hostility towards slavery as justification. By the time winter ended, 7 states had broken away and formed the beginnings of a new confederacy. The atmosphere in southern towns reflected the mixture of exhilaration and dread. Parades and bonfires marked secession. Young men drilled with muskets in courthouse squares, and newspapers printed bold headlines proclaiming independence. Yet behind the jubilant public face, quieter worries emerged. Mothers whispered about the sons who might soon be soldiers. Shopkeepers wondered how long imported goods would last if conflict broke supply lines. Enslaved people, listening from kitchens, fields, and slave quarters, absorbed every fragment of news, knowing that their fate was bound to these decisions, though they had no voice in them. Rumours circulated among them. Some spoke of freedom if the North prevailed, others feared harsher conditions as slaveholders tightened control in anticipation of unrest. In the North, the news of secession struck like a sudden illness. Shock rippled across cities and towns as citizens tried to grasp what it meant for a republic that had prided itself on unity. Newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia filled their pages with editorials. Some argued that the South should be allowed to go in peace, that forcing them back would be tyranny. Others insisted that disunion could not be tolerated, for it would unravel the very fabric of democracy. The idea that states could leave whenever displeased would turn the Union into a fragile league, unable to endure challenges. The political debates in Congress grew heated, with senators and representatives giving farewell speeches as their states seceded. Empty desks in the chamber became daily reminders of the unravelling nation. The federal government under President James Buchanan responded with hesitation bordering on paralysis. Buchanan condemned secession as illegal, yet insisted the federal government lacked the power to coerce states back into the Union. This position satisfied no one. Northerners accused him of weakness, while Southerners pressed their advantage, seizing federal forts, arsenals, and mints across the South with little resistance. Each day seemed to bring new reports of seizures, of flags hauled down, of Union officers resigning their commissions to join the Confederacy. Washington, D.C. itself felt exposed, its loyalty uncertain, its streets filled with whispers of conspiracy. Amid this uncertainty, leaders in the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, in February 1861 to create a provisional government. They drafted a constitution that mirrored much of the United States Constitution, but made explicit what the original had left ambiguous. Slavery was protected, and no law could deny or impair the right to own human beings. Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former Secretary of War, was chosen as president. His inauguration was celebrated with fanfare, as if the Confederacy had stepped confidently into the world as a new nation. Yet even in those jubilant ceremonies, the question lingered. Could this fledgling government survive against the industrial might and larger population of the Union? For many ordinary Americans, North and South, the secession crisis created confusion more than clarity. Farmers ploughing fields in Ohio or Virginia knew that political leaders argued in distant capitals, but what did it mean for their crops, their debts, their families? Merchants wondered if trade routes would collapse. Ministers preached on Sundays about God's will, some declaring secession righteous, others pleading for peace. Immigrants, many recently arrived, were bewildered to find their adopted country splitting apart. And always, enslaved people remained at the centre, their labour underpinning the economy, their fate the silent axis around which the entire crisis turned. The weeks between Lincoln's election and his inauguration stretched long and anxious. Each newspaper headline brought rumours of new secessions, new seizures of forts, and new declarations. Would the Union dissolve completely before he even took office? Would compromise emerge at the last moment to halt the slide? Or would the inauguration of a president who had not yet spoken in office be the final push into war? The nation held its breath, knowing that by spring the future of the Republic would be decided not only by words but inevitably by action. And so, in the cold winter of 1861, as 7 states left the Union and others hesitated at the brink, America stood on a precipice. The election had not only chosen a president, it had chosen a path. Yet the deeper question remained unresolved. Could Lincoln, a man of compromise by nature but principle by conviction, preserve a Union that seemed already lost? Or would his first months in office confirm Southern fears and ignite the full blaze of civil war? The long wait between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861 was filled with uncertainty that bordered on paralysis. The nation drifted in those months like a ship without a rudder, its captain yet to board. James Buchanan remained in office, but his passivity deepened the sense of crisis. Secessionists pressed their advantage, seizing arsenals, forts, and mints almost unopposed, while Unionists lamented that the federal government seemed unwilling to defend its own property. As the weeks slipped away, the sense grew that the United States was dissolving before its citizens' eyes. Lincoln, still in Springfield, Illinois, chose his words carefully, issuing no inflammatory statements that could deepen the fracture before he had the authority to act. He built his cabinet with deliberate balance, bringing in men of varied factions. William Seward, once his rival as Secretary of State, Salmon Chase, a fierce anti-slavery voice, as Secretary of the Treasury, Edward Bates of Missouri, a border state figure, as Attorney General. The selection was more than political. It was strategic. Lincoln needed unity within his own ranks before he could face a divided nation. Behind the calm public front, however, he received constant reports of secessionist victories, the seizure of customs houses, and the growing militancy of Southern rhetoric. The clock ticked toward his inauguration, each day narrowing the chances of peaceful resolution. The journey to Washington itself symbolized the tension of the hour. Lincoln's whistle-stop train tour took him through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, where massive crowds gathered to see him, cheer him, and test whether this tall, awkward lawyer truly embodied the hope they had invested in him. He spoke briefly at each stop, offering reassurance rather than fire, reminding listeners that the Union was perpetual, that differences could still be resolved. Yet beneath the excitement lurked real danger. In Baltimore, authorities uncovered an assassination plot forcing Lincoln to slip through the city under disguise in the dead of night. By the time he arrived in Washington, he had already become not only a president-elect but a target of hatred. The capital city he entered was itself precarious. Washington was surrounded by slave-holding territory, with Virginia just across the Potomac and Maryland divided in its loyalties. The streets buzzed with rumors that secessionists would storm federal buildings or that Southern militias would march on the city. Soldiers quietly reinforced the city, while officials worried whether Lincoln could even survive to take the oath. On March 4th, 1861, under heavy guard, Lincoln stood on the steps of the unfinished Capitol dome and delivered his inaugural address. The speech was both conciliatory and resolute. He insisted that he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he also declared secession void. The Union, he argued, was older than the Constitution itself, a bond that no state could legally dissolve. He promised to uphold federal law in every state, while extending a hand of friendship to the South. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said, urging that the mystic cords of memory might yet bind the nation together. Yet even as he spoke those hopeful words, the reality was stark. The Confederacy had formed, its president inaugurated, its flag unfurled. His appeals could not erase the decisions already made in Montgomery, or the cannons already aimed at Fort Sumter. In the South, the reaction to Lincoln's speech was defiance. Southern newspapers dismissed his promises as hollow, and his reassurances as deceit. They noted pointedly that his refusal to recognize secession meant confrontation was inevitable. Confederate leaders, now under Jefferson Davis, moved rapidly to consolidate authority, organizing an army, appointing officers, and establishing systems of taxation and trade. The Confederate Constitution, adopted in March, openly enshrined slavery as a cornerstone, declaring it the natural condition of black people and elevating it from tolerated practice to founding principle. In their minds, compromise was no longer possible. They had built a new nation, and they intended to defend it. For ordinary citizens, the weeks after Lincoln's inauguration were filled with anticipation that was equal parts dread and determination. In the North, volunteers drilled on courthouse greens, some eager for the fight, others grimly resigned. In the South, militias paraded through streets, their uniforms mismatched but their spirits fierce. Families wrote hurried letters to loved ones, unsure whether they would see them again before war began. Ministers in pulpits preached sermons about divine justice, each side convinced that God favoured their cause. The newspapers carried every rumour, stoking anxiety with reports of new troop movements, seized ships, and fiery speeches. The Republic seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first strike. That strike, when it came, fell upon Fort Sumter. Lincoln had chosen a cautious but firm course. He would send supplies, not reinforcements, to the isolated garrison. The act was defensive in nature, yet to Confederates it was an insult, a refusal to surrender what they considered their territory. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, unwilling to allow the Union flag to remain in Charleston's harbour, ordered the bombardment that began at dawn on April 12, 1861. In that moment, the waiting ended. Words gave way to cannon fire. Negotiation gave way to war. The election of 1860 had thus accomplished what decades of debate, compromise and legislation could not. It forced the nation to reveal its fracture. By elevating Lincoln to the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote, the Union had declared the inevitability of sectional division. By responding with secession, the South had turned political disagreement into disunion, and by opening fire on Fort Sumter, it had transformed disunion into war. The ballots of November had led directly to the gunpowder of April. For the men and women living through it, the connection was clear. The campaign rallies, the parades, the heated debates, all had seemed like the normal noise of democracy. Yet those same ballots had opened the path to a conflict that would consume the nation for 4 years, cost more lives than any war in American history, and redefine the meaning of freedom itself. The election of 1860 was not just an election. It was the hinge on which the Union turned from uneasy compromise to bloody reckoning. And so, as the first smoke of war drifted over Charleston Harbour, the nation stepped into an era it could neither avoid nor fully comprehend. But how would the enthusiasm of newly enlisted soldiers and the confidence of political leaders fare when met with the grim reality of battle? Would the volunteers who cried, "On to Richmond," in the spring of 1861, still cheer so loudly after they faced their first true clash of arms at Bull Run? Charleston Harbour, in April 1861, carried a tension that had been building for months, like a storm pressing on the horizon. The harbour itself was deceptively calm. Ships swayed gently in their slips, gulls cried overhead, and the spring air drifted warm from the Carolina coast. Yet beneath this quiet surface, the city vibrated with expectation. Men in grey uniforms filled the streets, militia units drilling on cobblestones, while women stood on balconies watching, their faces lit by both pride and unease. The cannons positioned along the shoreline faced outward toward Fort Sumter, their black muzzles glinting in the sun, silent but ready. Everyone knew the standoff could not last much longer. Fort Sumter was little more than an unfinished fortress, a man-made island of brick and stone in the centre of the harbour. Its commander, Major Robert Anderson, was a Kentuckian by birth, a career soldier who had once owned enslaved people himself, yet now stood loyal to the Union. Inside his garrison, only about 80 men held the fort, their rations running low, their powder limited. For weeks, Anderson and his officers had watched the ring of Confederate guns grow tighter around them. They endured taunts from Charleston's crowds, who sometimes rowed out to jeer across the water. Each sunrise brought another day of waiting, another rumour of reinforcements, another question of whether Washington would act before it was too late. For Abraham Lincoln, the fate of Fort Sumter became an unavoidable test of principle. To abandon the fort would concede legitimacy to the Confederacy. To reinforce it with troops risked appearing as the aggressor. His decision to send only supplies, food, medicine, fuel, was calculated as a middle course. The Confederacy would then face its own test, allow the resupply and tacitly admit Union authority, or stop it and fire the first shot. Jefferson Davis and his advisers chose the latter. They reasoned that waiting meant weakness, and weakness meant disintegration. If the Confederacy was to be a nation, it had to act like one. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, in the darkness before dawn, a single mortar shell arched into the sky from Sullivan's Island. Its white flash burst high above the harbour, illuminating the water for a brief instant before fading. It was the signal to open fire. Almost at once, Confederate batteries unleashed their barrage. The guns on Morris Island, James Island, and the Charleston shoreline thundered, their projectiles whistling through the air toward the fort. Flames leapt as shells exploded against brick walls, shattering masonry and sending echoes across the water. The city's residents, awakened by the roar, rushed to rooftops and balconies to witness the bombardment. Some cheered with each explosion, waving handkerchiefs and flags. Others stood silent, knowing that whatever was being born in those flashes of light would claim lives far beyond the harbour. Inside Fort Sumter, Anderson's men scrambled to return fire, loading their cannons under a rain of shot. But their arsenal was limited, and many of their guns faced the wrong direction, never completed in the years before the crisis. Smoke filled the fort's casemates, choking men as they hauled powder and shot through darkened corridors. Fires broke out, igniting wooden structures, threatening to spread to the powder magazine itself. For 34 hours the bombardment continued, relentless and deafening. Yet remarkably, no soldier was killed in the fighting. The greatest danger came not from enemy shot but from exhaustion, suffocation and accident. Charleston society treated the bombardment almost like a theatre. Crowds lined the Battery Promenade, picnic baskets in hand, watching as if the war had opened with a grand performance staged for their benefit. Young men boasted of volunteering soon, confident the conflict would be swift and glorious. Southern newspapers rushed to print descriptions of the shelling, casting it as the Confederacy's baptism by fire. The flag of the United States, still fluttering above Sumter's battered walls, became the centre of focus. Every volley seemed aimed at its cloth, as if bringing it down would confirm that the Union's hold was broken. On the afternoon of April 13th, with the fort burning and supplies gone, Anderson agreed to surrender. He negotiated honourable terms. His men would be allowed to evacuate, carrying their flag with them. During the 100-gun salute to mark the evacuation, tragedy struck. The premature discharge of a cannon killed 2 Union soldiers. These were the first deaths of a war that would go on to claim more than 600,000 lives. The irony was stark. The bombardment itself had taken no lives, but the ceremony of surrender had drawn blood. The fall of Fort Sumter reverberated instantly across the nation. In the North, the news was electrifying. Lincoln, seizing the moment, called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. His proclamation framed the conflict as the defense of the Union, not aggression against the South. Across northern towns and villages, men rushed to enlist. Parades filled streets, and bands played patriotic tunes. It seemed, in those first days, as if the country had rediscovered unity in the face of rebellion. The war was expected to be brief, with many convinced that a single decisive battle would restore the Union. In the South, the bombardment was celebrated as proof of Confederate resolve. Bells rang, cannon salutes echoed, and speeches hailed the victory as divine favour. The remaining Upper South states, which had hesitated before, now faced their decision. Within weeks, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina and Arkansas joined the Confederacy, their loyalty cemented by what they saw as Northern aggression. Richmond was chosen as the new Confederate capital, a symbolic and strategic shift that placed the heart of the rebellion just 100 miles from Washington. For enslaved people across the South, the meaning of Fort Sumter was more complex. Some overheard their enslavers celebrating and wondered whether this meant harsher conditions and deeper entrenchment of bondage. Others whispered that the war might bring freedom, that the turmoil could open cracks in the system that held them. Though their voices rarely entered newspapers or official records, their quiet anticipation carried weight, for they understood better than anyone that this war, whatever its initial aims, would ultimately determine their fate. The first shots at Fort Sumter therefore did more than open the war. They crystallized the irreconcilable division of the nation. Compromise was no longer possible. Negotiation had given way to artillery fire. The United States and the Confederacy now faced each other as enemies, and the people of both sections braced for a conflict whose scale none could yet imagine. But what would happen when the enthusiasm of these first weeks met the battlefield? When volunteers who had paraded proudly through their towns faced the smoke, confusion, and blood of real combat, would their confidence endure? And would the leaders who spoke so confidently of swift victory still believe in quick triumph once their armies collided for the first time on the rolling fields of Virginia? The thunder of cannons over Charleston Harbor echoed far beyond South Carolina. Within days of Fort Sumter's surrender, the American Republic shifted from uneasy division into open war. The bombardment had clarified what months of debate could not. Secession was no longer theory, and the Union could no longer avoid action. When news of the fort's fall reached Washington, Abraham Lincoln acted with urgency. On April 15th, 1861, he issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days, a span of time chosen because many believed the rebellion would be crushed swiftly. The call swept across the North like a spark thrown into dry tinder. In New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, crowds surged into streets, cheering as recruiters opened offices and hung flags from buildings. In smaller towns and villages, church bells rang as men gathered in public squares to enlist. Farmers left their fields, clerks abandoned their desks, students put down their books, all seized by a sense of duty or excitement. The idea of a short, decisive war drew men in droves, convinced they would return home before the harvest. Families watched proudly as fathers, brothers and sons marched away, uniforms hastily stitched, muskets borrowed or purchased. For many it was the first time they had travelled far from home, and the adventure of soldiering seemed almost intoxicating. The enthusiasm was not limited to volunteers. Women organised sewing circles, producing uniforms, flags and blankets. Communities raised funds to support soldiers' families, while ministers preached sermons equating enlistment with moral duty. Songs filled the air, from the Star-Spangled Banner to newly written anthems promising Union victory. Newspapers carried stirring accounts of regiments forming and parading, their banners inscribed with patriotic mottos. It was a season of optimism, a belief that the Union's size and strength would overwhelm the rebellion quickly. Yet beneath the music and parades, practical challenges emerged. The Union had no standing army large enough to wage such a war, and the volunteers flooding into camps outnumbered the supplies, weapons and officers available to train them. In the South, the reaction was equally fervent. The successful defence of Charleston Harbour emboldened secessionists, who now believed their new Confederacy had proven its legitimacy through force. Jefferson Davis issued his own call for volunteers, and young men rushed to defend their states with the same zeal that Northern recruits displayed. Plantations sent sons to officer ranks, small farmers enlisted in militias, and entire communities pledged loyalty to the Confederate cause. In Richmond, Montgomery, and Nashville, speeches promised that Southern valor, combined with the righteousness of their cause, would guarantee victory. The belief that one Southern soldier was worth several Northerners in battle became a common refrain, echoed in newspapers and taverns alike. Secession, however, remained incomplete. The Upper South states, which had hesitated before, now made their choice. Virginia's secession on April 17th proved decisive, bringing with it not only manpower, but also military tradition, industry, and the symbolic weight of George Washington's home state. Soon after, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina followed, swelling the Confederacy's ranks to 11 states. Richmond was chosen as the new capital, its proximity to Washington daring the Union to respond. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained contested, their loyalty uncertain, their communities fractured by civil conflict. The fate of these regions would play a crucial role in shaping the war's geography, but for now, the momentum of secession seemed unstoppable. As the armies formed, the differences between North and South became starkly visible. The Union possessed greater population, industry, and infrastructure, with railroads crisscrossing its territory and factories capable of producing weapons and uniforms. The Confederacy, though weaker in resources, benefited from experienced officers who had resigned from the U.S. Army, men like Robert E. Lee, Joseph Johnston, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Both sides believed their advantages decisive. Northerners trusted in numbers and machines. Southerners trusted in courage and tradition. Each assumed the other would falter quickly. The organisation of these raw volunteers into armies revealed the realities of war. Camps sprouted outside cities, their rows of tents filled with green soldiers unaccustomed to discipline. Training was often chaotic, led by officers scarcely more experienced than the men they commanded. Rifles were scarce, and some early regiments drilled with wooden sticks or outdated flintlocks. Sanitation was poor, disease rampant, and camp life quickly proved harsher than many had imagined. Yet morale remained high, sustained by the belief that hardships would be temporary. Most volunteers still expected to fight 1 or 2 battles and return home victorious. In Washington, the influx of troops transformed the city. Streets once quiet filled with columns of marching men, their drums and fifes echoing off government buildings. The unfinished Capitol dome loomed over this martial scene, a symbol both of national endurance and of the work left incomplete. The city braced for possible attack from nearby Virginia, its bridges guarded and its outskirts fortified. Lincoln, now surrounded by soldiers, felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever. He spent long hours reviewing regiments, shaking hands with volunteers, and projecting confidence, even as he wrestled privately with the enormity of the task before him. For ordinary Americans, the war's arrival meant sudden disruptions. Families were divided, especially in border regions where brothers chose opposite sides. Merchants saw trade rerouted or halted, farmers adjusted to the absence of labour, and women assumed new burdens at home. Letters became lifelines, carrying words of reassurance from camps to households anxious for news. The war was no longer an abstraction debated in legislatures or newspapers. It had entered kitchens, barns, workshops and churches, reshaping daily life with startling speed. As spring turned to summer, the initial enthusiasm pressed inevitably toward confrontation. Both governments felt pressure to prove their legitimacy with a decisive victory. In the north, calls of "On to Richmond" urged an advance into Virginia to crush the rebellion swiftly. In the south, the defence of their new capital became a matter of pride as well as strategy. Troops on both sides, still untested, prepared to meet one another for the first time. The march toward battle was no longer avoidable, and so the first weeks after Fort Sumter were filled with energy and expectation. Flags waved, drums beat, speeches rang, and recruits drilled in dusty fields. Yet beneath the spectacle, the war machine creaked into motion, slowly grinding volunteers into soldiers. Both sides imagined the conflict would end quickly, but the fields of Virginia were about to teach them otherwise. For when these newly raised armies finally collided near a small creek called Bull Run, the romance of war would vanish in the smoke of cannon and the cries of the wounded. The question hung heavy in the summer air. When the first real clash came, would either side be ready for the reality of civil war? By July 1861, the United States had transformed from a divided nation into one bracing for its first true trial of arms. The month since Fort Sumter had been filled with parades, drilling, and speeches that promised a swift end to rebellion. Northern newspapers pressed for an advance on Richmond, insisting that the rebellion could be crushed with a single decisive blow. Southern leaders, equally confident, prepared to defend their new capital with what they believed to be superior spirit and skill. Both sides, still untested, marched toward confrontation near a small Virginia town called Manassas Junction, along the banks of a modest stream known as Bull Run. The geography of the place seemed ordinary, yet its position made it vital. Manassas lay at the junction of key railroads that connected the Shenandoah Valley to Richmond, providing the Confederacy with the ability to shift troops rapidly. For the Union, seizing this junction would open the road to Richmond itself. On July 16th, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell led nearly 35,000 Union troops south from Washington, their green uniforms and bright flags stretching along dusty roads. The march itself revealed the inexperience of his army. Men lagged behind, food spoiled in poorly managed supply trains, and discipline broke down as soldiers stopped to pick berries or nap in fields. They were eager but unready, a collection of volunteers still learning the very basics of soldiering. In the Confederate camp, General P.G.T. Beauregard commanded about 22,000 men positioned along Bull Run. Reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston, moving swiftly by rail from the Shenandoah Valley, would soon swell their numbers. The railroads gave the Confederacy a critical advantage, allowing Johnston's troops to arrive on the battlefield faster than Union intelligence expected. This use of rail transport to shift entire brigades marked one of the first examples in modern warfare of trains altering the pace and scale of battle. What seemed like a quiet Virginian countryside was about to become the stage for a collision that neither army truly understood. The morning of July 21st dawned warm and clear. Union troops advanced across creeks and meadows, pushing back Confederate pickets in scattered skirmishes. Civilians from Washington had followed the army, some in carriages, carrying picnic baskets and opera glasses as if expecting to watch a grand performance rather than a bloody battle. They gathered on nearby hillsides, their presence a surreal reminder of how little the public grasped the reality of war. For the soldiers, however, the day's ordeal soon erased any sense of spectacle. McDowell attempted a flanking maneuver, sending Union columns across Bull Run to attack the Confederate left. At first, the plan seemed to succeed. Federal troops drove Confederates from Matthews Hill, pressing them back toward Henry House Hill. Cheers rose from Union ranks, and some officers believed victory was within reach. But on Henry House Hill, a brigade of Virginians commanded by General Thomas J. Jackson stood firm. Jackson, a stern, eccentric man of deep religious conviction, urged his men to hold their ground with the calmness of stone. A fellow general, rallying retreating Confederates, pointed toward Jackson's line and cried, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians!" From that moment Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall, and his stand became the turning point of the day. As the afternoon wore on, Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail, tipping the balance. The battle devolved into chaos. Smoke from cannon and musket fire hung thick over the fields, obscuring friend from foe. Union regiments, poorly coordinated and confused by contradictory orders, wavered under counterattacks. Civilians who had come to watch now fled in panic as stray bullets and shells reached their vantage points. Horses bolted, wagons overturned, and the once orderly advance unravelled into a frantic retreat. Union soldiers, unused to the noise and slaughter, broke ranks and ran. What began as a withdrawal soon turned into a rout. The road back to Washington became choked with fleeing soldiers, wagons, and terrified civilians. Stragglers dropped muskets, cast aside blankets, and abandoned cannon as they rushed northward. Panic spread faster than officers could contain it. Rumours of Confederate pursuit, though exaggerated, fueled the stampede. Lincoln, waiting anxiously in Washington, learned that what had been expected as a quick victory had instead become a humiliating defeat. The illusions of an easy war had shattered in a single afternoon. For the Confederacy, Bull Run was celebrated as proof of their superiority. Richmond rang with bells, and newspapers declared the South invincible. Yet their victory carried its own burden. Many Southerners believed the war was already won, that the Union would never recover from the humiliation. This overconfidence would blind them to the industrial and numerical might of their opponent. For the North, the defeat was sobering but galvanizing. Far from breaking resolve, it hardened determination. Lincoln immediately called for 500,000 additional volunteers and reorganized the army under new leadership. The realization dawned that the conflict would be longer, bloodier, and more demanding than anyone had hoped. The fields around Bull Run, once quiet meadows, bore the scars of this first great clash. Houses lay shattered, fences splintered, and the Henry house itself stood riddled with bullets, its elderly resident killed during the fighting. Graves dotted the ground where soldiers from both sides had fallen. The sight of mangled bodies and the stench of death lingered for weeks, reminders that the war would not spare either army. The volunteers who had marched south with songs on their lips now returned silent, their illusions broken. Bull Run revealed the nature of the struggle ahead: disorganized armies, inexperienced officers, and the brutal reality that modern war would be neither swift nor glorious. It marked the end of innocence for both Union and Confederacy. Each now understood that victory would demand endurance, sacrifice, and years of fighting. The dream of a 90-day war was gone, replaced by the grim recognition of a national ordeal. Yet even as the smoke cleared, the larger questions loomed. Would the Union's resources and manpower eventually crush the rebellion, or would Confederate determination and skill carve out independence? Could Lincoln's government sustain support at home as casualties mounted? And could enslaved people, still bound in fields and cabins, transform this conflict from a war for union into a war for freedom? The first major battle had ended, but the war had only just begun. After the shock of Bull Run, both North and South realized that the war would not end quickly. The optimism of 90-day enlistments and promises of swift victory gave way to the sobering truth: this would be a long, grinding conflict. Armies that had once been a patchwork of militia units and volunteer regiments now had to be forged into disciplined forces capable of sustaining campaigns across years. For the ordinary soldier, this meant entering a life defined less by glory and battle than by routine, hardship, and an endless cycle of waiting. A soldier's day began before sunrise. Bugles or drums pierced the early light, rousing men from tents or makeshift shelters. Camps, often spread across muddy fields or forest clearings, came alive with the shuffle of boots and the clatter of tin cups. Roll call was taken with stern efficiency, and absences noted. Then came drill, hours of repetitive marching, wheeling and manoeuvring under the hot sun or biting wind. Officers barked commands, correcting lines, teaching men to move as one. For volunteers who had left farms, shops, or classrooms only months earlier, the tedium of drill was both frustrating and exhausting. Yet, it was essential. In the smoke and confusion of battle, only trained reflexes could hold a line against cannon and musket fire. Food dominated much of a soldier's thoughts. Rations were issued daily or every few days, often consisting of hardtack, salt pork, beans, and coffee. Hardtack, dense flour biscuits baked until nearly indestructible, became infamous. Soldiers joked it could stop a bullet, though more often it was home to weevils or maggots. The pork, preserved with salt, was frequently rancid, its fat congealed and foul-smelling. Beans offered some comfort when cooked in camp kettles, while coffee became a cherished necessity. For many Union soldiers, coffee was the one luxury they could rely on, its bitter warmth fueling long marches and sleepless nights. Confederate soldiers, cut off from steady supplies, often roasted chicory, corn, or peanuts as substitutes. Meals were plain, monotonous, and sometimes barely edible, but hunger made even poor food precious. Life in camp revolved around chores as much as drills. Soldiers fetched water, dug latrines, chopped wood, and maintained equipment. Tents needed constant repair, uniforms patched, and weapons cleaned. Disease lurked in every corner. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia claimed more lives than bullets. Lice-infested clothing, rats scurried through camps, and sanitation was often neglected. Surgeons, untrained in modern hygiene, reused instruments without sterilization, spreading infection. Men learned to fear the camp hospital, where the smell of sickness and the sight of amputations became routine. For many, survival in camp was more uncertain than survival on the battlefield. Letters home provided the emotional lifeline. Soldiers wrote to wives, parents, and sweethearts, describing camp life, expressing longing, and asking for news from home. Mail delivery became a treasured event, with men crowding around to hear their names called. Letters carried comfort, reminding soldiers of the lives they had left behind, but they also deepened homesickness. Many confessed in private correspondence that boredom and loneliness weighed heavier than fear of combat. They filled idle hours playing cards, carving wood, or singing songs around campfires. Music became an escape. Haunting ballads, cheerful folk tunes, and patriotic anthems drifted across the night air, binding men together in moments of camaraderie. Marches brought their own misery. Orders often sent regiments trudging for miles along dusty or muddy roads, carrying packs that weighed 40 to 50 pounds. Shoes wore thin quickly, leaving feet blistered and bloody. Roads littered with discarded gear told the story of exhaustion. Blankets, coats, even muskets thrown aside by men too weary to carry them. Rain turned the roads into quagmires, wagons mired axle deep, while heat baked men under heavy wool uniforms. Soldiers often joked grimly that their greatest enemies were mud, dust, and fatigue, not Confederates or Yankees. The war was fought less in moments of gunfire than in endless steps taken across hostile landscapes. For Confederate soldiers, scarcity was a constant companion. The Union blockade soon strangled southern ports, cutting off supplies of clothing, medicine, and food. Uniforms became tattered, shoes scarce, and blankets rare. Many fought barefoot even in winter, their feet wrapped in rags. Families at home struggled to send packages, but shortages plagued both soldiers and civilians. Northern troops fared somewhat better, supplied by industrial production and railroads, though corruption and mismanagement often left men hungry or ill-equipped. The disparity revealed itself in the smallest details. A Union soldier might grumble about stale hardtack, while his Confederate counterpart marched barefoot with an empty stomach. Despite hardship, bonds of brotherhood formed. Shared suffering welded men together in ways peace never could. Regiments drawn from single towns or counties became extended families. Soldiers cared for one another in sickness, shared rations, and risked punishment to sneak food or water to comrades. Humour softened the harshness. Men nicknamed their meals "salt horse," joked about lice as their bodyguards, and teased officers behind their backs. In these small acts, the common soldier found strength to endure. Yet beneath the routine and the jokes, every man knew that waiting ended eventually. Each drill, each ration, each march prepared them for the moment when muskets would crack and cannon thundered. They never knew when orders would arrive to break camp and march toward battle. The monotony of camp life gave way without warning to the terror of combat, and in those moments the long hours of drilling and the endless waiting proved whether an army would stand or scatter. The life of the soldier, then, was not one of constant heroics, but of constant endurance. It was measured in blisters, in hunger, in nights of damp ground and days of weary marching. It was a life that tested patience as much as courage, shaping men slowly into instruments of war. And as 1861 bled into 1862, the men in blue and grey began to learn that the war they had entered was not a brief interruption of a normal life. It was their new existence, one of repetition, deprivation, and anticipation. But what did this daily grind mean for their families at home? Those who waited, worried, and endured their own kind of battle far from the camps. How did the war reshape the lives of women, children, and parents left behind, carrying the burden of absence and uncertainty? As the war stretched beyond the hopeful summer of 1861, the camps that once felt temporary grew into sprawling settlements, more like crude towns than staging grounds. Rows of tents multiplied into grids, smoke from countless campfires drifted upward, and muddy paths wore into the earth where thousands of boots trampled daily. Soldiers who had once expected a short adventure realized that this was their new world, a world of waiting, repetition, and struggle against forces far more relentless than enemy bullets. Disease, boredom, and despair became their true adversaries. Illness spread through the camps with terrifying speed. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close quarters turned measles, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox into constant killers. Latrines were often dug too close to wells, and streams used for drinking became fouled by waste upstream. Surgeons with little understanding of germ theory could do little to stop the contagion. Men who had survived Bull Run or skirmishes along the Potomac now fell to fevers that burned through their regiments. The death toll from disease far outpaced that of battle, though the quiet passing of men in tents rarely made headlines. To the soldiers themselves, this invisible war was unrelenting, leaving empty spaces in mess lines and gaps in company rolls long before musket fire had its say. Desertion became another symptom of strain. For some, the monotony of camp life broke their spirit more than combat. Endless drilling, poor food, and harsh discipline pushed men to slip away under cover of darkness, vanishing into woods or returning to farms and families. Union records counted hundreds of thousands of desertions over the course of the war, while the Confederacy, where families suffered severe shortages, struggled even more to keep men in ranks. The pull of home was powerful. Letters describing starving children or failing crops gnawed at consciences, and many soldiers decided that duty to kin outweighed loyalty to flag. Commanders responded with strict punishments, lashings, branding, imprisonment, and in severe cases, execution. Yet no punishment could fully stem the tide. War demanded endurance that many men simply could not muster. Still, most soldiers stayed. Their reasons varied. Some clung to patriotism, others to comradeship, and many to the bonds forged by shared suffering. Regiments became families, their members unwilling to abandon one another. Soldiers spoke of a sense of honour, of not letting down the men beside them in the line. Even in misery, laughter and ritual sustained morale. Storytelling became a nightly tradition, with men spinning tales of home, exaggerating adventures or mocking officers. Practical jokes cut the tension, and songs filled the nights, some borrowed from popular culture, others invented on the spot. Humour softened the sharp edges of hardship, giving weary men a way to endure. Daily survival demanded improvisation. Soldiers carved utensils from wood, fashioned dice from bullets, and cooked rations in countless ways to disguise their blandness. Some mixed hardtack with bacon grease into a dish they called skilly-gaily. Others pounded it into crumbs and boiled it into a crude porridge. Confederate soldiers, with rations often scarce, boiled cornmeal into gruel or scavenged berries and roots. When opportunity arose, men hunted rabbits or traded with locals for eggs and milk. Raiding orchards or farm fields along the march became common, though it often sowed resentment among civilians. The ingenuity required to eat, sleep, and endure forged habits that would remain with many long after the war ended. Letters home continued to serve as lifelines, though as months turned to years, the tone shifted. Early enthusiasm gave way to frank accounts of hardship, longing, and despair. Soldiers wrote of lice, fever, and endless marching, of comrades buried far from home. Some concealed the worst from families, shielding mothers and wives from the truth. Others poured out grief and bitterness onto paper, knowing that even if their letters never reached home, the act of writing gave them solace. Mail call remained the highlight of camp life, the moment when a soldier's name called aloud connected him, however briefly, to the world beyond mud and tents. Punishments and discipline shaped the rhythm of camp as much as drills. Officers enforced order with severity, for without discipline armies dissolved. Infractions ranging from drunkenness to insubordination were punished with humiliating tasks. Carrying logs as extra duty, being tied to stakes for hours, or wearing placards labelling the offence. In both armies, desertion sometimes brought execution before assembled troops. The sight of a comrade shot by firing squad seared into memory as a grim deterrent. These harsh measures reflected the reality that discipline was the only glue holding together vast numbers of unwilling or exhausted men. Without it, chaos would overwhelm the camps long before the enemy did. As time passed, the line between soldiers and civilians blurred. Union camps sprawled across southern landscapes, disrupting local life. Civilians, particularly in contested border regions, lived side by side with soldiers, sometimes trading with them, sometimes resenting their presence. Confederate troops often camped near towns or farms, drawing on scarce local supplies. The presence of armies strained communities already suffering shortages. Civilians endured theft, requisitions, and the endless noise of military life. Soldiers themselves grew weary of the disruption, longing for peace, yet bound by duty and circumstance. Despite every hardship, many soldiers wrote of the strange mixture of monotony and terror that defined their existence. Weeks of drilling, eating and waiting could pass without incident, only to erupt suddenly into a battle that shattered dozens of lives in an afternoon. Then, just as abruptly, the survivors returned to camp, their routines resuming as if nothing had changed. The juxtaposition was jarring. Calm and chaos, boredom and bloodshed, alternating endlessly. For the common soldier, this was the essence of the war, a cycle of preparation, endurance, and occasional eruption into violence. By late 1861 and into 1862, armies on both sides had grown more professional, their soldiers hardened by the grind of daily survival. The romance of war had long faded. What remained was the resilience of men who learned to endure mud, hunger, disease, and despair while waiting for orders they could not predict. Their lives, though rarely remembered in detail, were the true foundation of the conflict. The grand speeches of presidents and generals mattered little without the patience of these men, who endured the endless waiting that made every battle possible. And yet, as their letters reveal, a deeper question always lingered in their minds. Was their suffering merely to preserve a political union or to defend a social order? Or would it, in time, change the very meaning of freedom in America? As the war stretched from months into years, the life of the common soldier settled into a rhythm both monotonous and punishing. Seasons passed not with the familiar cycle of farming or trade, but with the endless turning of campaigns. Spring and summer brought marches and battles, autumn meant new offensives or retreats, and winter delivered the long confinement of quarters where men endured cold, hunger, and homesickness in equal measure. The war, once imagined as a short interruption, had become a grinding reality that redefined survival itself. Winter camps revealed the extremes of soldier life. When armies halted after campaigns, they built log huts, dug trenches, and attempted to fashion comfort from scarcity. Chimneys of clay and sticks belched smoke into frosty air, while floors were lined with straw or whatever material soldiers could scavenge. Blankets were shared, fires burned constantly, and yet cold crept through cracks in walls and doors. Snow and mud mingled to create misery outside, and disease flourished in cramped quarters. Despite the discomfort, men often described these months as strangely bearable compared to the hardships of marches. The absence of constant movement and the chance to establish routine allowed friendships to deepen, songs to be sung, and time to be marked in small human ways. Letters from these winter quarters show men carving out pieces of ordinary life amidst war. Some described Christmas dinners improvised from meagre rations, decorated with pine branches or scraps of cloth. Others wrote of debating politics by firelight, sharing newspapers when available, or listening to sermons from chaplains who reminded them of home and heaven. Games of cards, checkers, and baseball filled idle afternoons, while fiddles and banjos offered music that echoed into the cold night. In these makeshift communities, soldiers clung to fragments of normalcy, building resilience that helped them endure when the spring campaigns began again. Campaign seasons, by contrast, tested endurance to its limits. Soldiers marched hundreds of miles through heat and rain, burdened with packs that grew heavier with each step. Rivers had to be crossed, mountains climbed, and swamps trudged through. Feet blistered and bled, shoes disintegrated, and uniforms rotted under constant exposure. Men dropped from exhaustion along the roadside, wagons broke down, and rations spoiled in the heat. Supply lines, stretched across hostile territory, often failed, leaving soldiers hungry for days. Rain turned encampments into seas of mud where tents collapsed and fires drowned. For many, the memory of these marches outlasted the memory of battles, the endless roads, the aching bodies, and the unrelenting grind of movement. When battle finally came, the shock of violence punctuated the monotony of waiting. Soldiers wrote that the sudden roar of cannon and musket fire tore through the weeks of boredom like a storm breaking calm skies. In the chaos, men who had endured months of hunger and drill found themselves thrust into moments that determined survival in seconds. Afterward, the survivors returned to the same routines, burying comrades, repairing weapons, writing letters, and waiting again for orders. The contrast between days of dull repetition and sudden violent clashes wore on their minds, leaving many with a haunted gaze that words could not capture. Coping mechanisms became essential. Faith was a powerful anchor, with many soldiers carrying pocket Bibles, attending camp services, or interpreting survival as divine providence. Others relied on humour, turning every hardship into a joke, comparing lice to pets, hardtack to teeth dullers, and officers' speeches to bedtime stories. Some turned to alcohol, smuggled from civilians or brewed from whatever ingredients they could find, while others played endless games of cards or dice, gambling away wages or personal belongings. These small rituals, though trivial, provided a sense of control in a world where most decisions were beyond their reach. The emotional toll was heavy. Letters reveal soldiers describing dreams of home, fears for families left behind, and uncertainty about whether they would survive another campaign. Some wrote tenderly of newborn children they had never met. Others confessed to losing hope of seeing parents again. For Confederate soldiers, whose families often endured hunger and raids, the worry was acute. Union soldiers, too, carried guilt for the hardships their absence created, especially among immigrant families relying on a single wage earner. The war stretched every relationship thin, binding soldiers not only to duty, but to longing that grew sharper with every passing month. As the years dragged on, endurance itself became the measure of success. Soldiers who had survived multiple winters and campaigns gained the weary confidence of veterans. They moved with discipline, understood the rhythms of marches, and hardened themselves against hunger and fatigue. Yet the cost was visible. Their faces aged prematurely, bodies grew thin, and their letters carried a weight absent in the early days. The optimism of 1861 had long vanished, replaced by a determination to see the struggle through, whatever its length. In this way, the common soldier became the backbone of the war. The speeches of Lincoln or Davis, the strategies of generals, and the clashes of great battles all rested on the daily endurance of men who cooked rancid rations, marched endless miles, dug trenches, and suffered fevers in tents. Their contribution was not only in moments of gunfire, but in every weary step, every hour of drill, and every silent night spent waiting. Without their patience and resilience, the war could not have been fought at all. And yet, when these men asked themselves why they endured, the answers were rarely simple. Some fought for union, others for liberty, others for their homes, and still others because leaving would betray the friends beside them. The meaning of their struggle shifted as months turned into years. For Union soldiers, the cause of preserving the nation gradually entwined with the promise of ending slavery. For Confederates, defense of home mixed uneasily with recognition of scarcity and despair. For the enslaved, the endurance of Union soldiers was watched with desperate hope, for their own freedom hung in the balance of that patience. Thus, the story of the common soldier is not one of heroics in every moment, but of survival stretched across years of hardship. Their lives, filled with boredom and endurance, were the true thread that stitched together the vast fabric of the Civil War. But beyond the camps and the marches, beyond the blisters and the boredom, there loomed another struggle: control of the Mississippi River, a vital artery that both North and South sought to command. How would the fight for this lifeline of trade and transport shape the course of the war? The Mississippi River, stretching more than 2,000 miles from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, was more than geography. It was the lifeline of the American interior. Long before the first cannon of the Civil War thundered, the river had carried flatboats laden with wheat, hogs, and corn from the Midwest, and cotton from the Deep South. Its waters connected frontier towns to distant markets in New Orleans and beyond, linking farms to the world economy. In 1861, as Union and Confederacy squared off, both sides understood that the Mississippi was no mere boundary. It was the spine of the continent, and control of it meant control of survival. For the Union, the Mississippi promised a way to divide the Confederacy. If Northern armies could seize the river, they would split the South in two, isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the eastern states. Supplies of cattle, sugar, and cotton from the west would be severed, leaving the Confederacy fractured and gasping. This idea formed a central piece of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, a strategy to strangle the South through blockade and river control. Critics mocked the plan at first, calling it too slow, but its logic was undeniable. Choke the arteries of trade, and the rebellion would wither. For the Confederacy, the Mississippi was both shield and lifeline. Its wide waters served as a defensive barrier, while its banks offered access to fertile fields and vital cities. New Orleans, perched at the mouth of the river, was the crown jewel, a city of commerce whose docks bustled with trade even under blockade. Farther north, Vicksburg stood on bluffs overlooking the river, a natural fortress commanding the waterway. As long as these strongholds remained in Confederate hands, the South could hope to keep the river open and maintain its link between East and West. The stakes were immense, and the river became not only a physical prize but a symbol of the war's outcome. The lives of people along the Mississippi changed instantly as war came. In river towns like Cairo, Illinois, and Memphis, Tennessee, wharves once crowded with steamboats became staging grounds for gunboats and troop transports. Soldiers bivouacked where merchants once sold goods, and taverns filled with uniforms instead of traders. Farmers found their fields requisitioned, their boats seized, their produce diverted to feed armies. Enslaved men and women, long forced to labour in cotton fields along the riverbanks, saw Union patrols as harbingers of possible liberation, even as Confederate patrols tightened restrictions in fear of escape. The great river, once a highway of commerce, transformed into a theatre of war. Naval innovation reshaped the struggle. The Union, drawing on its industrial power, built fleets of ironclad gunboats armoured with thick plating that could withstand cannon fire from riverbanks. These floating fortresses, bristling with heavy guns, brought unprecedented power to inland waters. Commanders like Andrew Foote and David Farragut spearheaded campaigns that pushed southward, pounding Confederate forts with relentless barrages. The sight of an ironclad steaming downriver, smoke pouring from its stacks, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, an emblem of the North's technological advantage. The Confederacy, with fewer resources, relied on ingenuity and geography. They fortified high bluffs with heavy artillery, dug trenches, and sank obstacles into the river to impede Union gunboats. They converted civilian steamboats into makeshift rams, plating them with iron and loading them with cannon. Though their navy was small, Confederate crews fought with determination, defending river towns with every resource they could muster. Forts like Henry and Donelson, perched on tributaries feeding into the Mississippi, became linchpins in their defensive chain. Holding them meant preserving the South's connection to the river. Losing them would open the door to Union advance. The first clashes along the river came in early 1862. At Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant and Andrew Foote combined land and naval power with devastating effect. Gunboats battered the forts from the water, while infantry pressed from land, forcing Confederate surrenders. These victories gave the Union its first major foothold in the West and revealed Grant as a commander of relentless will. More importantly, they opened pathways toward the Mississippi itself, showing that the Union's river strategy was more than theory. As word of these victories spread, Southern morale trembled. Communities along the Mississippi prepared for invasion, fortifying positions and stockpiling supplies. Families fled river towns, abandoning homes as Union gunboats steamed closer. In New Orleans, once a thriving city of international trade, anxiety grew as the blockade tightened and Union forces advanced. Cotton bales were burned to keep them from Northern hands, and citizens debated whether to resist or surrender if the fleet appeared. The war's reach was no longer confined to distant battlefields. It arrived daily with the splash of paddles, the boom of artillery, and the sight of armed vessels gliding along the river's current. The Mississippi thus became more than a strategic target. It was a living artery, carrying not only the lifeblood of the war, but also the hopes and fears of those who lived beside it. Its wide waters reflected the determination of both Union and Confederacy, each unwilling to yield the river's promise of survival. As spring campaigns gathered momentum, both sides braced for a contest that would decide whether the river remained a Confederate lifeline or became a Union blade cutting the South in half. Yet as Union gunboats pressed south and Confederate defenders rallied along bluffs and bends, a question grew heavier with each mile. Could any fort, however strong, resist the iron tide that the Union now unleashed on the waters of America's greatest river? By the spring of 1862, the Union strategy along the Mississippi shifted from probing attacks to bold thrusts aimed at the very heart of the Confederacy. The victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson had revealed the vulnerability of Southern defences and given Union commanders a new sense of confidence. Ulysses S. Grant, whose name had begun to circulate in Northern newspapers, pressed deeper into Tennessee, while the Navy expanded its flotillas of ironclads and gunboats. The river, once seen as a vast obstacle, now became a highway of invasion. At the southern mouth of the river lay New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy and its most vital port. Though far from the battle lines of Virginia, New Orleans pulsed with economic life. Cotton exports, sugar shipments, and international trade that linked the South to Europe. To lose the city would mean not only the loss of revenue, but also the symbolic collapse of Confederate prestige. The task of seizing it fell to Flag Officer David G. Farragut, a seasoned sailor whose fleet of wooden warships, backed by mortar schooners, braved the formidable defences guarding the city. Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, massive stone fortifications bristling. With heavy guns stood along the river below New Orleans, their cannons commanding the channel. Chains stretched across the water, barricades of sunken hulks and logs were laid to block passage, and Confederate ships waited to contest any advance. In April 1862, Farragut launched his daring assault. For days, mortar boats rained shells onto the forts, their explosions lighting the night sky. Then, under cover of darkness, Union sailors cut the chains and cleared a path. Farragut's fleet surged forward, enduring withering fire as shells screamed overhead and water churned with cannon shot. In a dramatic dash, his ships broke through, passing the forts and steaming upriver toward the city itself. The fall of New Orleans was swift once the fleet arrived. Confederate forces, unable to resist the naval onslaught, evacuated. Cotton bales were torched in the streets. Warehouses set ablaze to deny supplies to the enemy. The population, stunned and resentful, watched as Union troops marched in and raised the stars and stripes over the custom house. General Benjamin Butler took command of the city, his harsh administration earning him the contempt of locals, who nicknamed him Beast Butler. Yet for the Union, the capture of New Orleans was a triumph. The Confederacy had lost its greatest city, its access to the Gulf, and a vital artery of commerce. The Mississippi's southern mouth now lay firmly in Union hands. The fall of New Orleans tightened the noose, but the river's heart still belonged to the Confederacy. Northward, strongholds like Vicksburg and Port Hudson stood defiant, their guns commanding high bluffs that dominated the water. These positions could not be bypassed easily, for they controlled navigation and supply routes. The Union could send ships past, but without silencing the forts, the river could never be fully theirs. For the Confederacy, these towns became symbols of resistance, their names spoken with pride as bastions that held back the flood of northern power. The struggle for the Middle River intensified. In June 1862, Union gunboats clashed with Confederate river defences near Memphis. The battle unfolded not only with cannons but with ramming tactics. as ironclads and converted steamers collided violently, their hulls splintering under impact. The Union's superior fleet eventually triumphed, and Memphis fell, further opening the Mississippi to Northern control. Yet each advance underscored the central truth. Until Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy remained connected across the river, its western resources still feeding the eastern armies. For civilians along the riverbanks, the war transformed daily life into chaos. In towns seized by Union troops, loyalties were tested. Some residents welcomed occupation, hoping for restored trade and security. Others resisted quietly, hiding supplies or relaying information to Confederate forces. Enslaved people seized the opportunity to escape, fleeing plantations and seeking protection under Union patrols. Their presence in camps challenged the Union's own policies, forcing commanders to decide whether to return them to owners, employ them as labourers, or recognize them as free. The river became not only a battlefield of ships and forts, but also a corridor of human migration and upheaval. Meanwhile, Confederate soldiers stationed at Vicksburg and Port Hudson endured harsh conditions on the bluffs. Digging trenches, hauling cannon, and standing watch under relentless bombardment, they clung to the belief that their positions were impregnable. The Mississippi rolled below them, its waters wide and steady, carrying Union gunboats that tested their defences daily. Every sunrise brought the possibility of another attack, every sunset the knowledge that the enemy grew stronger. Yet Confederate morale held, buoyed by faith in the natural strength of their fortresses and the conviction that surrendering the river meant surrendering the Confederacy itself. Union soldiers, too, confronted hardship as campaigns pressed deeper into hostile territory. Long supply lines stretched back to the north, vulnerable to raids and guerrilla attacks. Heat, mosquitoes, and disease claimed as many lives as enemy fire. Swamps and bayous challenged every march, while river patrols faced hidden mines and ambushes from the banks. The Mississippi, though a prize, was also an unforgiving landscape that tested endurance as harshly as any battlefield. By the end of 1862, the Union had achieved dramatic successes. New Orleans captured, Memphis secured, and much of the lower river under its control. Yet the Confederate grip on Vicksburg remained firm, the city perched high above the water, commanding every bend with its guns, defying every attempt to force its submission. Lincoln himself recognized its importance, declaring, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." The struggle had narrowed to a single fortress, a single city whose fate would decide the future of the river. And so the Mississippi, once a symbol of commerce and connection, became the stage for one of the war's most protracted contests. The Union had carved open its southern mouth and pried away its northern reaches, but the heart still held firm. The question lingered in every camp and along every bend. Could the mighty bluffs of Vicksburg withstand the storm that was gathering against them? By early 1863, Vicksburg stood as the Confederacy's last great fortress on the Mississippi River. Perched on high bluffs overlooking a bend in the river, the city appeared almost untouchable. Its cannon commanded the waters below, and its fortifications bristled with earthworks and trenches that stretched for miles. Confederate leaders spoke of Vicksburg as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, convinced that no Union assault could dislodge it. Yet Abraham Lincoln and his generals knew that as long as Vicksburg remained in Southern hands, the Union's grip on the Mississippi was incomplete. To break the Confederacy, the city had to fall. The task fell to Ulysses S. Grant, whose persistence had already made him a rising figure in the West. Throughout the winter and spring of 1863, Grant experimented with ways to approach the city. He attempted to dig canals that would divert the Mississippi's flow, hoping to bypass the fortress. He tried expeditions through the bayous, cutting through swamps and tangled forests to approach from unexpected directions. Each attempt met with frustration. Floods washed away works, disease ravaged soldiers slogging through swamps, and Confederate defenders repelled advances. Yet Grant refused to abandon his goal. Unlike other commanders who hesitated in the face of setbacks, he pressed forward relentlessly, convinced that persistence itself was a weapon. In April 1863, Grant launched his boldest move. He marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, while Admiral David Porter's fleet ran the gauntlet of Vicksburg's guns. On a moonlit night, Union ironclads and transports slipped past the bluffs, shells exploding around them, decks splintered by cannon fire. Though some ships were lost, enough survived to ferry Grant's men across to the east bank south of the city. With this manoeuvre, Grant placed his army behind Vicksburg, cutting it off from reinforcements and opening the campaign that would seal its fate. Grant's army advanced inland, fighting a series of sharp battles at Port Gibson, Raymond, and Jackson. Each victory pushed Confederate forces back, scattering defenders who tried desperately to protect the approaches to Vicksburg. At Champion Hill, the largest battle of the campaign, Grant's troops smashed Confederate attempts to block his path, driving them in retreat toward the city's fortifications. By May, Grant's army encircled Vicksburg, laying siege to the fortress that had defied them for so long. Life inside Vicksburg during the siege descended into nightmare. Union artillery and gunboats bombarded the city day and night, shells exploding in streets and crashing through roofs. Civilians and soldiers alike dug caves into the hillsides for shelter, creating an underground world where families huddled together as earth trembled above them. Diaries describe women cooking meagre meals in the darkness, children covering their ears against the thunder, and the sick gasping in air thick with dust and smoke. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. Horses, mules, and even dogs were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers gnawed on pea bread and parched cornmeal, while civilians boiled shoe leather into thin soup. Hunger hollowed faces, and disease spread through the cramped shelters. Confederate soldiers manning the defences endured their own misery. Trenches baked in the sun by day and filled with rain by night. Lice infested uniforms, and rations shrank to near starvation. Still, they fought doggedly, repelling repeated Union assaults in May. Union soldiers, frustrated by heavy casualties, shifted to siege tactics, digging trenches closer and closer to the Confederate lines, planting mines beneath fortifications, and maintaining a constant pressure that wore down defenders. Grant's army grew stronger as reinforcements arrived, swelling to more than 70,000 men, while the Confederate garrison, cut off and starving, shrank in strength with each passing week. The people of Vicksburg described the city as a tomb. Nights glowed with the arc of shells, days echoed with the rumble of guns, and silence never lasted long. Newspapers ceased printing, supplies vanished, and hope ebbed with every sunrise. Confederate General John C. Pemberton, commanding the defense, faced impossible choices. He knew that surrender would open the Mississippi to Union control, splitting the Confederacy. Yet he also knew that his soldiers could not hold out indefinitely. Letters from the ranks begged him to act, while civilians, gaunt with hunger, prayed for relief that never came. On July 4th, 1863, after 47 days of siege, Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. The timing carried cruel irony. As the Union celebrated Independence Day, the Confederacy lost its greatest fortress. The surrender was formal yet humane. Grant, recognizing the desperation of his opponents, allowed Confederate soldiers to be paroled rather than imprisoned, sending them home rather than burdening his own supply lines. The Union flag rose over the battered city, and the Mississippi River, for the first time in 2 years, flowed unbroken under Northern control. The fall of Vicksburg was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The Confederacy was split in two, its western states cut off from the east. Supplies of cattle, grain, and men from Texas and Arkansas could no longer reach Confederate armies in Virginia or Georgia. Union gunboats now patrolled the river freely, carrying troops and supplies deep into the South. Abraham Lincoln, upon hearing of the victory, declared, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." It was a poetic acknowledgement that the river, once divided, was once again united under Union authority. For Confederate morale, the loss was devastating. Coupled with the defeat at Gettysburg just 1 day earlier, the surrender of Vicksburg shattered the illusion of invincibility. Southern newspapers mourned the double blow, while civilians confronted the grim reality that the war would not be won quickly, if at all. For Union citizens, the news brought jubilation, fireworks, and renewed faith that ultimate victory was possible. Yet the cost of the siege lingered in the memories of those who endured it. Civilians who had lived in caves carried scars of hunger and trauma long after the war ended. Soldiers who had fought in the trenches remembered Vicksburg not as a single moment of triumph or defeat, but as weeks of unrelenting strain, where every day tested their endurance. The river, once a symbol of commerce and life, had become a place of suffering and decision. The Mississippi struggle had ended, but its lessons stretched beyond the bluffs of Vicksburg. It showed that victory would not come through single battles alone, but through patience, endurance, and the steady tightening of pressure. The Confederacy had been cut in half, yet the war raged on, promising years more of hardship and sacrifice. And so, the question shifted. With the river secured, how would the war now be fought on land? Would the armies, hardened by sieges and battles, endure the brutal campaigns that lay ahead in fields from Tennessee to Virginia? When war erupted in 1861, its shadow fell not only on the men who enlisted, but also on the women who remained behind. For many, the Civil War began with a farewell, on a porch, in a parlour, or at a train station, where husbands, brothers, or sons kissed them goodbye, promising a swift return. The reality proved far harsher. As armies filled the fields, women filled the gaps left behind. They became providers, caretakers, and in ways that surprised the age, active participants in the conflict itself. Their contributions, often unseen or uncelebrated, shaped the course of the war as surely as any battle. On farms and plantations, the departure of men transformed daily survival into women's responsibility. Fields still needed planting, animals feeding, debts paying, and children raising. In the north, wives and daughters took up ploughs and tools, labouring through seasons once managed by male hands. In the south, women not only maintained homes but also managed enslaved labourers, their authority complicated by suspicion and resistance. Letters exchanged between soldiers and their wives reveal both pride and strain. Husbands urged wives to be strong and patient, while wives described the exhaustion of endless chores and the loneliness of empty beds. For many, the war at home was no less demanding than the one fought on the battlefield. Hospitals became another domain where women's presence redefined the war. At the beginning, military officials resisted the idea of female nurses, clinging to notions of propriety. But the sheer scale of suffering soon made their service indispensable. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, became known as the Angel of the Battlefield, tending to wounded soldiers in the midst of combat. Dorothea Dix organised the Army Nursing Service, setting strict rules for women who volunteered. They had to be over 30, plain in appearance, and dressed modestly. Thousands of women answered the call, binding wounds, administering medicines, and comforting the dying. Their diaries and letters describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Rows of amputated limbs piled outside tents, the stench of infection, and the groans of men enduring surgeries without anaesthesia. Yet within this suffering, women brought a sense of humanity, holding hands and offering words that eased pain when medicine could not. The war also opened doors into espionage. Women, often overlooked by male authorities, used their invisibility to their advantage. In the South, Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a Washington socialite, charmed Union officers into revealing secrets, which she passed to Confederate commanders. Her network of informants provided intelligence that influenced battles in Virginia. In the North, Harriet Tubman, already famed for leading enslaved people to freedom, served as a scout and spy for the Union Army. She organized reconnaissance missions, guided raids into South Carolina, and gathered information from the enslaved about Confederate movements. Women like these demonstrated that loyalty to cause could be wielded with cunning as well as courage, and that war was not confined to muskets and cannon fire. Even those who never saw a battlefield bore the war's weight daily. In cities under siege, women endured shortages and hunger alongside their children. In Richmond, Confederate women rioted in 1863, storming bakeries and demanding bread as supplies dwindled. In the North, women organised sanitary fairs to raise money for medical supplies, selling quilts, preserves, and handmade goods to support the war effort. Churches became hubs of activity where women collected bandages, clothing, and food to send to soldiers. Each small act of stitching, packing, or cooking linked the home front to the front lines, creating a chain of support that sustained armies through hardship. The emotional burden was perhaps the heaviest. Women waited months for letters, scanned newspapers for casualty lists, and feared every knock on the door might bring news of a loved one's death. Widows multiplied in every community, forced to shoulder economic and social responsibilities alone. Mothers buried sons, wives raised children without fathers, and sisters wrote elegies for brothers who would never return. Their grief was both personal and collective, shaping the memory of the war long after the battles ended. And yet, within these burdens, there was also transformation. Women who had been confined largely to domestic spheres found themselves managing farms, businesses, hospitals, and networks of espionage. The war forced them into visibility, challenging assumptions about what women could or should do. While the nation fought over slavery and secession, it also witnessed a quieter shift in gender roles, one that hinted at future struggles for rights and recognition. The Civil War, then, was not only fought in trenches and fields. It was carried in kitchens where mothers rationed food, in hospitals where nurses braved contagion, and in secret meetings where spies whispered intelligence. Women, bound by circumstance, expanded their roles in ways that changed both their lives and the fabric of American society. But as their responsibilities grew, so too did the dangers. What happened when women stepped directly into the machinery of war? When they took on the roles of soldiers, disguised and fighting alongside men, their true identities hidden until death or discovery. Though most women experienced the Civil War from homes, hospitals, or supply lines, some stepped into roles that defied every convention of their time. They crossed boundaries deliberately hidden from them, disguising themselves as soldiers, infiltrating enemy lines as spies, or smuggling supplies under the noses of officers. In a war that tested the limits of society itself, women discovered both opportunity and peril in the shadows of battle. Disguised soldiers became one of the war's most extraordinary, though often overlooked realities. Women cutting their hair short and binding their bodies enlisted under male names, blending into the ranks beside brothers and strangers alike. Some sought wages to support their families, others longed to fight for causes they believed in, and a few followed loved ones to the front lines. Their deception often went unnoticed until wounds or death revealed the truth. Diaries and records tell of dozens, perhaps hundreds, who marched, drilled, and fired muskets, their identities hidden behind uniforms. The discovery of a woman's body in the aftermath of a battle often startled officers, who recorded it with astonishment. These women, invisible in life, became known only in death, their courage written in the silence of their sacrifice. Spies faced constant danger, their lives hanging on secrecy. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the famed Confederate spy in Washington, exemplified both success and risk. She passed critical information to Southern commanders, her intelligence credited with aiding Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run. Yet her activities eventually drew suspicion. Arrested and imprisoned in her own home, she continued smuggling messages hidden in sewing or carried by couriers. Even under guard, her determination did not waver, though exposure ultimately brought her downfall. For every well-known name like Greenhow, there were countless lesser-known women who carried notes in hems of dresses, signalled troop movements with lanterns, or eavesdropped in parlours where officers spoke too freely. The Union, too, employed female spies. Harriet Tubman, whose daring had already led enslaved people to freedom, turned her skills toward intelligence gathering. Working with Union commanders in South Carolina, she organised networks of scouts, many drawn from those escaping bondage. She personally guided raids up rivers and through swamps, gathering knowledge of Confederate positions and supply lines. Her work combined espionage with liberation, each mission undermining the Confederate war effort while expanding freedom. Her contributions, though often minimised in her own time, reflected the way women shaped the war from beneath its surface. Other women engaged in smuggling, slipping medicine, weapons and letters past blockades and guards. In Richmond, Union sympathisers hid information in hollowed eggs or tucked beneath hats. In occupied New Orleans, women defied Union officers openly, carrying supplies to Confederate prisoners or spitting insults at patrols. Some were jailed for their defiance, their names entered into military records as troublemakers who refused to bend. Their resistance, though small in scale compared to battles, carried symbolic weight. Every smuggled letter, every hidden weapon, kept the spirit of resistance alive in communities under occupation. The war blurred the line between battlefield and home. In some places, the front passed directly through towns, leaving women face to face with soldiers. They nursed the wounded in parlours, hid valuables from foragers, and sometimes stood between their homes and armed men demanding food or shelter. In border regions like Missouri and Kentucky, guerrilla warfare turned civilians into combatants against their will. Women there endured raids, retaliations, and suspicion from both sides, their loyalty questioned constantly. Survival demanded caution, ingenuity, and at times, impossible choices. One of the most haunting aspects of women's involvement was their silence. Many never revealed the full extent of what they had done. Disguised soldiers returned home after the war and resumed female identities, carrying secrets unspoken to their families. Spies who risked their lives often saw their deeds dismissed as incidental, overshadowed by the fame of generals. Nurses who held dying men's hands slipped back into obscurity once peace returned. The war gave women roles outside tradition, but it rarely granted them recognition when it ended. Yet for those who lived it, the experience left indelible marks. Women who had marched in uniform remembered the rhythm of drums and the terror of fire. Those who spied carried memories of coded messages and fearful glances, always unsure who could be trusted. Even those who remained in homes scarred by raids bore the imprint of a war that had transformed their daily lives into acts of endurance. Their participation, often unseen, expanded the very definition of what it meant to fight. The Civil War was fought by nations, by armies, by men whose names filled history books, but it was also fought by women who entered spaces not meant for them and endured dangers for which they were never trained. Their service, though scattered and hidden, formed a quiet battlefield of its own. And as the war dragged on, one truth became undeniable. Women's labour, loyalty and sacrifice were no longer confined to the sidelines. They had stepped into the machinery of war itself. But what happened to those who endured not only the absence of husbands or the danger of espionage, but the crushing responsibility of holding families together when survival itself was uncertain? While some women marched onto battlefields disguised in uniform or risked capture in the shadows of espionage, the vast majority waged their war in kitchens, fields, and quiet homes. Their weapons were endurance and sacrifice, their battlegrounds the daily struggle to keep families fed and safe, while the men who had once borne those burdens were far away. This war at home was invisible to generals drawing maps and presidents issuing proclamations, yet it carried consequences as deep as any fought with bayonets and cannon. For many women, the first struggle was survival itself. In the North, the absence of husbands meant farms and small businesses had to be maintained by wives and daughters who had never before ploughed fields or negotiated with creditors. They learned quickly, taking on debts, planting crops, and managing livestock. The war demanded competence, and necessity erased hesitation. In the South, the challenge was magnified by the tightening Union blockade. Goods grew scarce, prices soared, and luxuries vanished first, followed by essentials. Flour, salt, and cloth became precious commodities. Women improvised constantly, spinning their own thread, boiling substitutes for coffee, and stretching meals to feed hungry children. Their letters reveal the anxiety of providing for families with cupboards nearly bare, their handwriting shaky with exhaustion but determined to continue. Grief seeped into every household. News of battles arrived in newspapers or through neighbours, each list of casualties sending dread into communities. A knock at the door might bring a folded letter announcing the death of a husband or son. Women became both mourners and anchors, burying the dead while holding together households that grief threatened to shatter. Widows often found themselves with no legal rights to property, forced to fight for inheritance while still cloaked in mourning. The war multiplied their numbers, turning entire towns into places where black dresses became the uniform of daily life. Children felt the absence acutely, and women bore the weight of explaining the unexplainable. Mothers soothed fears at night, telling children their fathers would return even when they knew the truth lay buried on distant fields. They taught sons to plough too early, daughters to mend too soon. Their efforts created resilience, but also etched an early maturity into young faces. In this way, the war shaped not just the present but the next generation, moulding children under the pressures of absence and deprivation. For enslaved women in the South, the war brought both suffering and possibility. As Confederate men marched away, plantation discipline often tightened, with mistresses and overseers clinging desperately to control. Yet Union advances brought opportunity. Enslaved women fled whenever Union troops appeared, carrying children on their backs, risking capture, and braving uncertain futures in the hope of freedom. Some joined contraband camps where conditions were harsh, but liberty beckoned. Others found work as laundresses, cooks, or nurses for Union armies. Their courage redefined the meaning of the war itself, turning it from a conflict over Union into a struggle for emancipation. Their resilience, though often unrecorded, changed the very structure of American society. The psychological strain of waiting became its own torment. Weeks turned into months without letters, and silence weighed heavier than words of loss. Women developed rituals to manage fear, lighting candles, wearing lockets, or reciting prayers daily for absent soldiers. Communities organized support groups, where widows and wives leaned on one another in shared hardship. Churches filled with women, their prayers blending into a collective plea for protection, guidance, or simply endurance. These gatherings created networks of support that outlasted the war, shaping bonds that held communities together in Reconstruction. Yet within this suffering, women discovered strength they had never imagined. Managing farms, raising children alone, negotiating with officials, and enduring hunger forged new identities. Some, after years of independence during war, resisted returning fully to pre-war roles. The experience left a legacy, subtle at first but powerful over time. When later generations pressed for women's suffrage and greater rights, they would look back to the Civil War as proof that women had shouldered the nation's burdens when it mattered most. The war's end did not end women's struggles. Widows faced poverty, their pensions meagre and hard to obtain. Mothers carried grief in silence for the rest of their lives. Children raised without fathers bore scars invisible but deep. Yet memory itself became women's final battlefield. They preserved letters, stitched quilts from uniforms, and told stories to grandchildren of the men who had marched away. They tended graves, decorated them with flowers, and kept alive the meaning of sacrifice long after drums fell silent. In doing so, they ensured that the Civil War was remembered not only through battles and generals, but through the endurance of families. The Civil War tested women in ways neither they nor their nation expected. They endured hunger, grief, and danger, and in doing so, they transformed themselves and their society. Their war was not fought with muskets, but with courage measured in days of waiting, nights of fear, and years of resilience. And yet, as they emerged from this crucible, one question lingered. If women had proven themselves capable of shouldering so much, would the peace that followed recognize their strength? Or would the nation return them to silence while it rebuilt on the sacrifices they had made? When cannon fire opened the war in 1861, Abraham Lincoln insisted that the Union fought only to preserve itself. In speeches and proclamations, he carefully avoided framing the conflict as one against slavery. His caution reflected political reality. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, still permitted slavery, and their loyalty hung by a thread. Should Lincoln move too quickly, they might have joined the Confederacy, leaving the capital surrounded and the Union fatally weakened. Yet even as the president held back, events across the battlefront made clear that slavery could not remain untouched. Enslaved people themselves forced the issue. From the war's earliest days, they fled plantations near advancing Union armies, seeking refuge behind northern lines. At first, commanders were uncertain how to respond. Legally, enslaved people were considered property, and returning them seemed consistent with existing law. But officers on the ground recognized the absurdity of sending fugitives back to men actively in rebellion. General Benjamin Butler, stationed at Fort Monroe in Virginia, devised a solution in May 1861. He declared that those fleeing bondage were contraband of war, property seized from the enemy that could be used to the Union's advantage. The term contraband stripped away humanity and legal language, yet it also opened the door to freedom. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children began streaming into Union camps, their presence making slavery impossible to ignore, the presence of fugitives, unsettled soldiers, and civilians alike. Union camps that had expected to manage only rations and drills now found themselves sheltering families who needed food, clothing, and protection. Some officers pressed them into labour, building fortifications or cooking meals. Others recognized their skills and knowledge as invaluable, gathering intelligence about Confederate movements from those who had toiled on plantations and along supply routes. Slowly the idea spread. These men and women were not merely escaping, they were actively undermining the Confederacy and aiding the Union cause. Every field left untended, every labourer gone, weakened the Southern war effort. Public opinion in the North shifted unevenly. Many soldiers, especially early volunteers, had enlisted to save the Union, not to end slavery. Some resented the presence of fugitives in their camps, fearing competition for wages or harbouring racial prejudice, yet others grew convinced through direct experience that slavery was the root of rebellion. Letters home reveal soldiers who began to question their assumptions after watching women and children arrive barefoot, clothed in rags, yet determined to seize liberty. Their suffering and courage etched itself into the minds of men who had once claimed indifference to slavery. Slowly, the moral weight of the war began to shift. In Washington, politicians debated fiercely. Radical Republicans in Congress pressed Lincoln to strike directly at slavery, arguing that no union could be restored while the institution endured. Conservatives urged caution, fearing the loss of border states and the backlash of Northern Democrats. Lincoln walked a careful line, advancing step by step. In August 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, declaring that enslaved people used for Confederate military purposes could be seized and freed. A year later, the Second Confiscation Act went further, declaring freedom for all enslaved people owned by rebel masters. Each law inched closer to national emancipation, though enforcement varied across battlefronts. Meanwhile, the enslaved continued to act. They fled in ever-growing numbers, guided Union troops through unfamiliar terrain, and spread news of advancing armies. Some men enlisted in contraband regiments even before official policy allowed it, proving their willingness to fight for freedom. Women in camps cooked, sewed, and nursed, carving out spaces of independence in the shadow of Union tents. Their determination made clear that emancipation was not merely a question of politics, it was a reality already unfolding on the ground. By mid-1862, the pressure on Lincoln grew unbearable. The war dragged on with mounting casualties, and victory seemed distant. European powers watched closely, weighing whether to recognize the Confederacy. Emancipation offered both a moral weapon to rally Northern support and a diplomatic shield to prevent Britain and France, nations that had long abolished slavery, from siding with the South. Yet Lincoln hesitated, insisting that timing mattered. A proclamation after Union defeats would appear desperate. He waited for a victory that could give weight to such a declaration. That moment arrived in September 1862 at Antietam. Though the battle was tactically inconclusive, Union forces halted Lee's invasion of Maryland. Lincoln seized the opportunity. On September 22nd, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be forever free. The announcement electrified the nation. Southerners denounced it as proof of Northern hostility, Northerners debated its wisdom, and enslaved people greeted it as a beacon of hope. The Union, Lincoln had declared, now fought not only for survival but for freedom. The path from contraband camps to proclamation revealed a profound truth. Emancipation was not a gift handed down from above. It was wrestled into being by the enslaved themselves, by soldiers who bore witness, and by leaders who finally recognized that the Union could not exist half free and half enslaved. The war had shifted course. What began as a fight for political unity had become a struggle for human liberation, and yet, as 1863 dawned and the proclamation took effect, questions remained. Would freedom declared on paper translate into freedom lived in practice? Would formerly enslaved men be allowed to fight as soldiers in the Union ranks? And would the nation accept them as equals in the cause of victory? When the sun rose on January 1st, 1863, it lit a divided nation. In the north, crowds gathered in churches, meeting halls and city squares, waiting anxiously for word that President Lincoln had signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. In the south, enslaved men and women whispered rumors of freedom, watching the movements of Union armies and weighing when and how to seize the moment. The proclamation, though ink on paper in Washington, resonated like a drumbeat across fields, rivers, and battle lines. It did not free every enslaved person instantly, for its reach extended only to territories still in rebellion. Yet it redefined the war's purpose and opened a door that could not be closed. For the enslaved, the proclamation carried immediate meaning. News spread unevenly, by word of mouth, by newspapers smuggled into the South, by Union soldiers who read the words aloud in occupied towns. Families who had endured generations of bondage heard that the president had declared them free. On some plantations, enslaved people dropped their tools and walked off the fields, heading toward Union lines. In contraband camps, celebrations erupted with hymns and prayers, voices lifted in gratitude not only for Lincoln's words, but for the courage of those who had fled before emancipation was law. The proclamation did not end slavery everywhere at once, but it gave legitimacy to the freedom already being claimed on the ground. Union soldiers, too, absorbed the new reality. Many who had enlisted to save the Union now found themselves part of a war for liberation. Some embraced the shift, seeing it as a moral crusade that gave deeper meaning to their sacrifices. Others resisted, resenting the presence of fugitives in camps, or fearing competition for labour after the war. Yet the army could not ignore the transformation. Every step into Confederate territory now carried the weight of emancipation, for wherever Union troops marched, slavery's grip weakened. The flag became not just a symbol of union, but of freedom, and soldiers who carried it often found themselves greeted by men and women falling to their knees in prayer or singing songs of deliverance. The Confederacy responded with fury. Leaders denounced the proclamation as proof of northern barbarity, a declaration of servile war that, they claimed, sought to incite slave uprisings. Southern newspapers thundered with threats, warning that black Union soldiers, if captured, would not be treated as prisoners of war but as criminals to be executed or enslaved again. Jefferson Davis issued orders condemning Union officers who led black troops, branding them outlaws. For the Confederacy, emancipation hardened their cause, transforming secession into a desperate fight not only for independence, but for the preservation of a social order built on bondage. The proclamation's most immediate military consequence was the enlistment of black soldiers into Union ranks. Lincoln's administration had hesitated before, fearing backlash from white voters and soldiers alike. But by 1863, manpower shortages and the moral clarity of emancipation converged. Recruitment began in earnest, and formerly enslaved, men lined up to enlist. For them, the war was not about political abstractions, but about freedom, family, and the hope of dignity. Each uniform donned by a black soldier was both a declaration of loyalty to the Union and defiance against centuries of enslavement. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts, commanded by white officers but filled with black volunteers, demonstrated courage in some of the war's fiercest battles. At Fort Wagner in South Carolina, the 54th charged against impossible odds, many of its men falling under heavy fire. Their sacrifice shattered doubts about the bravery of black troops and silenced critics who claimed they would not fight. By war's end, nearly 180,000 black men had served in Union uniform, about 10% of the army, turning the tide of manpower decisively. Their presence changed not only the battlefield but the moral tenor of the conflict. Life for black soldiers was not easy. They faced lower pay than white counterparts, harsher duties, and constant prejudice. Some officers refused to lead them, and some white soldiers scorned them. Yet their determination to fight was unshakable. Many carried memories of whippings, chains, and family separations into battle. Their rifles aimed not just at Confederates, but at the institution that had scarred their lives. Their participation also forced white Northerners to confront uncomfortable questions about equality. Could men who bled for the Union be denied citizenship when the war ended? Could their courage be ignored once the guns fell silent? On plantations deep in the South, emancipation's impact varied. In some regions, enslaved people fled en masse, leaving fields empty and owners desperate. In others, Union armies were too distant, and masters clung to control through violence and intimidation. Yet even in those places, change seeped in. Rumours of freedom weakened obedience, and small acts of resistance multiplied. Work slowed, tools disappeared, and enslaved people asserted small choices that defied absolute mastery. The proclamation hung over every plantation like a storm cloud, promising that bondage's days were numbered. In the North, reactions were mixed. Abolitionists celebrated the proclamation as a divine turning point, churches ringing bells and newspapers hailing Lincoln as the great emancipator. Yet critics remained. Northern Democrats accused Lincoln of turning the war into a crusade that would prolong bloodshed. Riots broke out in some cities, most famously in New York in July 1863, when anger over the draft fused with racial hostility into days of violent mob attacks. These eruptions revealed the fractures within Northern society, where not all shared the same vision of freedom. Still, the proclamation had altered the course irrevocably. No peace could now be negotiated that restored slavery. The war would be fought to its bitter end. The Emancipation Proclamation was thus both limited and immense. It did not free slaves in border, states, or in Confederate areas already under Union control, but it transformed the Union's cause, making abolition inseparable from victory. It gave enslaved people hope, rallied black men to arms, and closed the door to European recognition of the Confederacy. Most of all, it declared to the world that the United States, once divided by slavery, now fought toward a future without it. Yet freedom declared was not freedom secured. The war still raged, and enslaved people still toiled under masters across much of the South. The Union Army would have to march mile by mile, state by state, to make emancipation real. And even then, the question lingered. What kind of freedom would follow? Would it mean true equality, or only survival without chains? The Emancipation Proclamation, though celebrated in the North and dreaded in the South, did not settle the question of freedom. Instead, it opened a new chapter of struggle, one that unfolded unevenly across the landscape of war. In regions under Union control, the words of the proclamation carried real power. Plantations abandoned by fleeing masters were seized, and the enslaved declared free by the presence of Union troops. In other regions, far from Union lines, life remained unchanged for months, even years. Masters withheld the truth, and armies moved too slowly to enforce the law. In places like Texas, freedom did not arrive until June 1865, when Union soldiers finally brought word that slavery was over. Between those dates stretched years of uncertainty, where freedom was a promise waiting to be delivered. Union armies became the agents of emancipation. Each advance carried with it not only soldiers and cannon, but also the expectation of liberation. Enslaved people flocked to encampments by the thousands, creating sprawling contraband camps that tested the army's capacity. These camps were both havens and hardships. Families built shacks from scraps, shared meagre rations, and lived under the constant threat of disease. Yet within them, schools opened, churches formed, and the first fragile steps toward independence began. Missionaries and teachers, often from northern abolitionist societies, arrived to teach reading and writing, believing literacy was the foundation of freedom. For many former slaves, the first time they held a book was within these camps, a symbol that their children's lives would be different from their own. The service of black soldiers further reshaped the war's meaning. By 1864, they fought in every theatre of the conflict, from the swamps of Louisiana to the trenches before Petersburg. They manned fortifications, raided plantations, and stormed Confederate positions with remarkable courage. At the Battle of Milliken's Bend, poorly trained but determined black troops fought hand-to-hand with Confederate attackers, their bravery shocking even hardened officers. At Fort Pillow, when Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred surrendering black soldiers, outrage swept the North, hardening resolve to see the war through to unconditional victory. Each of these moments carried political weight, reminding Northerners that the struggle was no longer only for Union, but for the lives and dignity of men who had earned freedom with blood. For the Confederacy, the presence of black Union soldiers struck at the heart of their ideology. The very sight of men once enslaved now bearing arms against them undermined claims that slavery was natural or divinely ordained. Southern leaders raged that these soldiers would spark uprisings, while common soldiers met them with a mix of fear and fury. Yet their presence on the battlefield was undeniable. Every regiment raised added to Union strength and diminished Confederate hope. Lincoln himself came to see emancipation as the moral center of the conflict. In letters and speeches, he acknowledged that the war had given the nation a new birth of freedom. By 1864, his re-election campaign openly tied Union victory to the end of slavery, a stance that would have seemed impossible in 1861. The bloodshed by black soldiers and the determination of the enslaved who fled to Union lines left no room for retreat. The war could not end with slavery intact.